Chapter 105, Obito Chisui, the one wee marks gets hotter when you are closer. Obito wasn't all that old when someone finally explained to him why the twist of colors on his wrist grew warm at random times. Whenever he spent time outside of the Uchiha compound, it cooled to the same temperature as the rest of his skin, usually unless he was inside the academy, where it warmed up until it felt like his fingers did after holding a mug of hot chocolate. The one time he had slipped past the gate guards and gotten lost exploring the forest surrounding the village, his mark had cooled until it felt like when he played outside in the winter without any gloves. 7 years old wasn't very much, but Obito would be quick to tell anyone who asked that someday he was going to be the strongest shinobi in the village, that someday he was going to be Hokage. These ideals were all that were keeping him from crying, tucked away in the shadows between his grandmother's house and the neighbors, when he realized that his mark had grown hot. Obito wiped absently at his unshed tears with one hand while he squinted at the wrist of his other. This happened quite a lot whenever he was inside his clan's compound, but it had never been quite this warm before. His grandmother told him when she explained the mark that this meant his soulmate was supposed to be nearby. "There's not even anybody here," he heard a squeaky voice exclaim from somewhere nearby. "Stupid mark. Lying isn't nice." Very carefully, Obito leaned over and poked his head around the corner. The street was empty but for a young boy who looked only 1 or 2 years older than himself. Obviously a fellow Uchiha, the boy had uncharacteristically fluffy hair, large eyes, and a rounded chin. He was also stomping his feet as he marched his way down the dusty road, visibly on his way down into a good temper tantrum. Although he tried very hard to stay still and just let the other boy pass without noticing him, Obito was horrified when suddenly he heard himself sniffle without even thinking about it, his nose still a little runny from trying not to cry and his body acting reflexively. He cringed when the boy in the middle of the street suddenly whipped his head up from where he had been glaring at the mark on his wrist. Upon spotting someone else hidden in the shadows between 2 houses, his entire face lit up and he nearly tripped himself as he hurried towards where Obito had squeaked and retreated farther into his hiding spot. "Hey! Wait!" By the time the boy had squeezed his way into the tiny gap as well, Obito had curled into himself and buried his face in the arms he had wrapped around his knees. He recognized the boy now as being a friend of the head family, and although he didn't know the other's name, he did know that this boy was way out of his social caste. Someone like him had no business talking to someone like Obito. Even at such a young age, Obito understood that he would never mean much to the rest of his clan until the day when he could unlock his Sharingan. "Why are you hiding? What's your name?" "I'm Chisui." When Obito refused to look up, the boy crouched down a little lower. "Hey, come on, I'm not scary. Please tell me your name." "Obito," he said quietly. "Hi, Obito." The boy just sounded so cheerful and he was too curious to resist. Slowly he peeked out over top of his folded arms to see a brilliant smile beaming down at him from underneath fluffy curls. "There you are. Why were you crying?" "I wasn't crying. I'm gonna be Hokage someday and Hokage don't cry." "You're not Hokage yet," Chisui pointed out triumphantly. "Which means that it's okay to cry now." I guess so. But it was just some kids being mean and the cashier says crybabies don't get to become Hokage." Chisui made a rude noise and then laughed easily. "My mom says anyone can become Hokage as long as they grow up big and strong. So just promise me that you'll grow up big and strong and I'll root for you to become Hokage one day, okay?" "Okay." Obito wiped his eyes again, his signature wide smile creeping up on him just as quickly as it always did. "Why were you yelling at your mark before?" He was surprised to see Chisui rub at the back of his neck shyly, as though embarrassed to have been caught doing such a thing. "It was feeling really hot, like maybe my soulmate was nearby, but it does that all the time and I've still never been able to find them." Peeking down at his own mark quickly, he asked, "Is it still hot?" "Yep. Mine is too. Really hot. Actually, I don't think it's even been this hot before." And it hadn't. The skin underneath the pretty twist of colors felt like his fingers did if he held them too close to a flame, just on the edge of getting burnt, so hot it was nearly uncomfortable. "Really? Can I see?" Chisui shuffled closer, his eyes running all over the visible parts of Obito in search of his mark. The younger boy giggled and held out his wrist for the other to see. He wasn't prepared for Chisui to gasp and reach out, grabbing a hold of the appendage with both hands only to cradle it as though it were a precious object. For a moment he was confused until he spotted the mark adorning one of the older boy's wrists. It was the same twist of colors, exactly identical, and he knew what that meant without either of them having to speak any further. Warmth filled him, pushing away the lingering shadow of sadness in favor of excited wonder. "You're my soulmate," he breathed. "My mark wasn't lying. You're really here. I found you." Shisui threw back his head and gave vent to a howl of triumph that had Obito's blood sinning inside his veins. The sheer happiness in that one sound nearly threatened to overwhelm him. No one had ever been so happy to be with him before in any kind of context, not even just friends. "Is that okay?" he couldn't help but ask. No matter how much he liked to pretend for the outside world that he was a confident person, the words of the people who teased him often stayed with him for much longer than he would have liked to admit. "Okay." Shisui blinked, still grinning. "This is awesome. Mom always said I had to be more patient because I might not find my soulmate until I was older, but I knew you were close. I could feel it." Before he could say anything else, Obito felt both of his hands being tugged on as Shisui leapt to his feet and pulled them both out of the shadows, back towards the abandoned road. The two of them broke into a run with one hand each still clasped together between them. "Come on. You can come meet my mom and I can say I told you so." Obito only laughed and tried to run faster. His wrist was hot like the summer sun and he hoped it would never grow cool again. Chapter 106, Shisui is Sakura, the one where you have a spirit guide. Despite the fact that she had irrefutable proof that Sasuke was not her destined soulmate, Sakura had noticed the way her spirit guide really liked the Uchiha compound. Each time she passed near the entrance to the walled-off district in which every Uchiha in the village lived, the spirit which only she could see always attempted to trundle inside and, despite the fact that it couldn't speak, she always got the impression that she was being heavily judged for walking by without following where it wanted to go. For such a small slip of a thing, Sakura always wondered how her spirit animal could take the shape of a bear, of all things. It wasn't just any old bear either, but a massive grizzly with paws the size of dinner plates. Were it corporeal, she imagined it could punch straight through walls and snap bones like twigs between its teeth. It was not corporeal, however, and so it existed only as a shining creature of white and gold who could pass through solid objects and gave one hell of a death glare to those that dared to piss her off. When Sakura was 12 years old, she graduated from the academy and passed the test to become a genin of her village. That was the year she discovered just how big the world really was when she left the comfort and safety of home for the very first time. After the terrifying debacle in the Land of Waves, all Sakura wanted to do was find somewhere that made her feel safe again. There was something soothing about allowing her animal guide to lead her wherever it wished. Some part of her trusted that it knew where it was going and that only good things awaited her at her destination: no blood, no frightening men who could trap her mentor in watery cages, and no feelings of utter uselessness. Sakura wandered slowly after her trundling bear, absently noting how gently it walked despite its massive bulk. When the two of them passed through the entrance to the Uchiha compound, she barely even noticed. No one paid much attention to the young girl wandering through the streets of the Uchiha district despite the fact that she very obviously didn't belong there, her pink hair and bright red chapao making her stick out like a sore thumb. Most allowed their eyes to slide right over her as though it didn't bother them at all to see someone not of their clan mucking about in their designated area. Sakura trekked on and happily ignored them all in return, allowing her massive bear to guide her as she supposed he had always been meant to do, and smiling a tiny bit when it glanced back at her with an approving huff. Halfway through the compound, the bear turned off the main street and headed towards one of the less well-kept residential areas. From the couple of times she had come here to pick up Sasuke for impromptu training, she could tell that she was traveling in the exact opposite direction of where the head family lived and wondered whether that meant anything. Although Sakura wasn't entirely what she was expecting, she was still a little surprised when she ended up facing a homey little bungalow with a roof of clay tiles and a tidy vegetable garden out front. The mid-afternoon sun lit up the dusty street and gave the impression that she had somehow stepped into the scene of some kind of romantic movie. Her bear trundled on, marching steadily up the front steps and looking over its shoulder at her expectantly. Gathering her courage, Sakura followed. Would this be somewhere she could feel safe? Had she been right to follow her ethereal companion? Standing on a well-worn doormat, she had only just raised her fist to knock when the door before her swung open to reveal a boy several years older than her with messy black hair and a shiny crow of gold and white flapping enthusiastically above him up near the ceiling. Sakura gave a sharp cry of surprise as her bear rose up on its hind legs and let out a mighty roar just as the crow dove down at its head. The two animals met with a dazzling explosion of light, shards of glittering brilliance shattering in every direction only to fade into nothingness. All she was left with was the light of mid-afternoon and an admittedly pretty boy staring back at her in wonder, dark eyes as wide as the smile growing bigger and bigger with every moment. "Hello there," he greeted her softly. "What's your name?" "My name is Sakura," she told him. Then she frowned as looked around. "Is it gone?" "My bear is gone." "Yeah, so is my crow." "And that means, oh wow." The boy seemed utterly breathless and he was looking at her as though she had brought to him a wonderful gift, something he had been waiting for all his life. As distracted as she had been ever since the Land of Waves, it took a few moments for Sakura to finally catch up to what exactly had just happened. When it came to her at last, both hands flew up to cover her mouth. "Oh. Soulmate. You my soulmate." She gaped up at him, trying to take in more details than she had before. He looked older even than Sasuke's older brother, and it was obvious just from the way he held himself that he was already a successful shinobi. The headband across his forehead kept his messy curls away from his forehead, and the leather strap across his chest accentuated things that her blossoming hormones had only just begun to think about. And he was staring at her. His attention was entirely focused on her. Sakura was almost ready to swoon as she cleared her throat and clasped her hands behind her back in an attempt to look demure. "You didn't tell me your name." "Shisui," he declared, beaming somehow even brighter than before. "Well, I can't believe I really found my soulmate after all this time. You'd think having a guide with wings would mean I was supposed to be the one to find you, but this is good too. I'm sorry it took me so long." "Don't be. I'm glad to meet you, Sakura." Me too." His eyes swept down her form and back up, probably taking in twice the details about her as she had about him. She wondered if he had unlocked the famous Uchiha Sharingan and what it would feel like to have it focused on her, what he could see with it. His gaze settled on the headband resting atop the crown of her head. "You wouldn't happen to be the same Sakura who's on my cousin's Genentine, would you?" "Sasuke?" "Yes, I am." "Incredible." Shisui laid a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. "Our spirit guides always take the forms that they do for a reason, you know. I can tell you're going to be an amazing kunoichi someday, Sakura." Tears welled up unbidden in her eyes and she dashed them away fiercely. No one had ever believed in her so fast, not even herself. After the experience of their very first mission outside of the village, she had been feeling weaker than ever, and Shisui's words hit hard in a place she generally tried to keep buried. "I guess so," she whispered shakily. Shisui nodded as though they had made a pact and squeezed her shoulder again, leaning down so that their faces were close together. "Believe it," he told her. He looked incredibly confused when she suddenly started to laugh. Chapter 107, Tobarama Wazuna, the one where you can hear each other's thoughts. Figuring out that his soulmate was an Uchiha wasn't all that hard. Since he could only hear the other voice in his head whenever the two clans met in battle, there was only one conclusion to draw from that. He wasn't all that embarrassed that it took him so long to identify exactly who it was, however his other half hadn't figured it out either, so he had that to make him feel better anyway. The thing about having a voice in your head connecting you to your soulmate was that the voice wasn't really an audible thing and therefore carried no hints towards gender or familiar sound. It was more of a direct communication from one mind to the other, words appearing in your thoughts that you knew you hadn't crafted yourself. Sir Tobarama thought he could be forgiven for not recognizing the person inside of his head despite how often they had stood face to face. Sure, every time they met both of their inner dialogues were mostly centered on their battle, but the same could be said everyone else present as well. It took until Tobarama had almost killed his own soulmate for him to identify the man, and admittedly, he was a little smart that he managed to figure it out first. Only moments before he was about to activate his newly perfected Hiraishin Jutsu, he heard words in the silence of his battle-clear mind which stopped him in his tracks. "Fuck, I know that look, he's got something up his sleeve. I think I'm about to die." lowering his sword and catching his own weight on the foot he had been about to step through space and time with. Tobirama narrowed his eyes at the man across from him. His opponent glared back at him and tightened his grip on his own sword. "I believe you are safer from Tobirama's blade than you think." His words caused Azuna to startle a little, eyes widening and flickering from side to side just barely. If he had known of the new jutsu, then he would also have known that taking his eyes off of Tobirama for even a single instant could mean death. Luckily for him, Tobirama was no longer watching for an opening to run him through. Instead, when he gathered his chakra and reached for a seal, it was the one attached to the kunai hanging from Hashirama's belt, the one his elder sibling had been instructed to throw in case of an emergency. When he appeared next to the pair of titans that headed their two clients, both Hashirama and Madara gave him eerily matching looks of surprise. Madara's expression rather quickly morphed into disdain, but Tobirama ignored him in favor of speaking quietly to his brother out of the side of his mouth. "Offer him peace," he mumbled reluctantly. Hashirama stared back at him like he'd grown an extra head. Admittedly, he had good reason to do so. Tobirama had been against the idea of peace ever since they were children, not convinced at all that it would ever succeed. "Really? Do it before I change my mind." "Ah, right." Beaming, Hashirama turned to Madara and blurted out his offer with fumbling enthusiasm. From across the field there came a hiss of surprise before Azuna hurried over to advise his brother against accepting the offer. Or at least that was what he was intending to do before Tobirama huffed and reprimanded him through their mental link. "If you wish to ever be with your soulmate, then you shouldn't interfere. What makes you think I would ever want to be with a senju? You stopped, didn't you?" And he had. Upon hearing Tobirama's words, he had stopped in his tracks without ever having said a word against the idea of peace, uncertainty clear on his face. With nothing to sway him from his course, Madara's slow motion forward ended with the two heads clasping hands as several clansmen around them gaped in astonishment. Stillness radiated out from them until not a soul on the battlefield so much as twitched, watching their leaders grin shyly at each other like little boys only just realizing that they could get up to whatever they wanted without their parents at home to ruin the fun. Inside his head, Tobirama could hear Azuna grumbling about how much he didn't like this and how poorly it was all going to turn out. Yet, tellingly, he did nothing to stop it. He did little more than slowly inch his way closer to his brother's side while glaring suspiciously at Hashirama as though the over-friendly senju might suddenly turn rabid at a moment's notice. Tobirama watched him subtly and realized with a pang of disappointment that, although he might have found his soulmate much earlier in life than he was expecting, it seemed they would still have a long way to go before any sort of relationship could form, whether romantic or platonic or however they were meant to fit together. When the senju quit the field that day, Tobirama made sure to send Azuna a silent goodbye, complete with as much sarcasm as he could possibly layer the words with. He'd never bothered to spare the other from his true personality before, and he certainly wasn't going to stop now. Not even the possibility of eventually being brought together with his destined other half was enough to make him contemplate hiding his natural self. Over the next several months, the senju and the Uchiha met for peace talks several times, and although he could hear Azuna calling out to him during each conference, Tobirama remained silent every time, thanking all the gods above that it was possible to shield one's thoughts. He didn't want to risk his counterpart putting two and two together, that only so many people in each party were present with any sort of consistency. Despite not having any for his sibling, patience was a well-known specialty of his, and he very much intended to bide his time, to not reveal himself until he could be sure that Azuna wouldn't simply flat-out reject any sort of bond with him on principle. It was a good plan in his books, a little lonely but very logical. He didn't account for having to listen to Azuna grumble his way through every meeting and slowly develop a slight infatuation as the months turned slowly into a year. By the time the village had begun construction and their clients were set to move to their new homes, his interest had blossomed into a full-blown and slightly mortifying crush. Even communicating with him in any sort of manner had become difficult, as he fought not to shame himself by blushing like a child going through puberty every time Azuna so much as met his gaze. Unfortunately, his usual method for hiding how he felt about things was either to scowl or to climb up and stay quiet. Since he didn't want to give the other man any more reason to dislike him, he chose to opt for the method of staying as silent as possible. Even more unfortunately, this meant that he was unable to put a stop to quite as many of Hashirama's stupid, fanciful ideas as he would have preferred. He'd thought he could count on Madara's grubbiness to block more of them, and it was exquisitely disappointing to watch the both of them descend rapidly back to childhood for the second time, all but giggling with their heads together and letting their drains fly free for the first time since either of them had seen their last haircuts. Tobirama very seriously considered asking them to get a room several times despite his brother's impending marriage to that Uzumaki woman. He was satisfied to note that Azuna seemed to share that urge if his grumblings were anything to go by. Only after the two clans had made the final step and merged themselves together to form a village at last did Tobirama finally speak to Azuna again. It wasn't that they really spoke to each other at first, more that neither of them bothered to shield themselves very much while both of them pretended they weren't interested in reaching out. It took nearly 3 months before their first direct interaction, and Tobirama very nearly gave himself away without even thinking about it. Overtired after spending the last few nights working on several different projects, his thoughts weren't nearly as focused as they should be. So when he looked out the window and spotted Azuna, his brain spat out the words without any filter. "You look terrible in purple. Maybe you should wear blue instead." "Say what?" Down in the street he watched Azuna screech to a halt and look around himself wildly, trying to spot whoever could see him at that moment. Tobirama dapped his head down just in case the other looked up and bashed it gently but repeatedly against the surface of his desk. "All right, that's it. Who are you?" "You obviously know who I am." "No. You can't just tell me no." "I just did. Therefore it would seem that I can." "A hint?" "Anything. If you are so insistent, then I will make you a deal. When you can honestly tell me that you wish to know me for more than the satisfaction of solving a mystery, then I will tell you my name." Proving his point without even meaning to, Izuna failed to answer. Tobirama sighed and gently bashed his head once more for good measure, cursing his full heart for being so cliché as to fall in love with a soulmate who didn't want him. How disgustingly romance novel of him. From that point on things were very different. The two of them communicated directly, engaged in actual conversation, and despite the terrible awkwardness in the beginning, it was surprisingly much easier for them to get along than Tobirama had expected. Of course, that may have been because Azuna had truly no idea who it was he was speaking to. Their communication face-to-face was a different story. It seemed that the other man held a bit of a grudge against him, a remnant of years of clashing with each other so often on the battlefield. They had been bred to hate each other, and in Azuna's mind he had yet to see a reason why he should lay that hatred down as long as they didn't get into a fight so big that it threatened the fragile peace between their clans. Tobirama was forced to wait still for his opportunity to reveal himself. After waiting months just to make contact, he resigned himself to a much longer stretch of time until anything could be done about the pesky feelings bubbling up in his chest with each conversation. In the end, it took a total of 2 years, 3 months, and 4 days before Azuna asked him a very carefully worded question. "Who are you?" "You're not supposed to ask me that, if you'll recall." "I wasn't supposed to ask until I really wanted to know." "So who are you?" "Ah." Seating merely across the room from the man asking, Tobirama closed his eyes and took a deep breath, bracing himself for all possible reactions. "If you really want to know, then I suppose I'm bound to admit that if you would but look straight ahead of yourself, you would find me." Were he merely a spectator, watching Azuna's reaction would have been priceless comedy. The dark eyes which had been roaming about the room in boredom very slowly rotated to look forward, even as a kind of dawning horror crept up in his expression. Their gazes met and all of the blood seemed to drain away from Azuna's face. At the head of the table where he was directing the meeting they were currently being bored to death by, Hashirama paused and asked if he was feeling all right. Looking somehow even more pale at being singled out, Izuna cleared his throat. "I'm fine. Go on." After giving him a dubious look, Hashirama shrugged and went back to speaking about crop yields and sustainability. Izuna went back to staring across the room from himself. "Tobirama." "Yes, Izuna." "Holy kami. Since when?" "Okay, don't answer that, obviously since always." "But seriously, it was you who asked." His soulmate glared at him, the most familiar expression between them. "Don't be facetious, you prick. You've known this whole time. Why didn't you say anything?" "Considering the reason I asked you to wait, I should think that question would answer itself." Izuna furrowed his brow and went silent, shielding his thoughts. Tobirama said nothing more and turned his attention to the front of the room, trying hard to ignore the thundering heart inside his chest. He'd been prepared for a much worse reaction, and yet some part of him had also been pitifully hoping for a much better one. As soon as the meeting drew to a close, Tobirama made an effort to slip away quietly. Those efforts were foiled when Azuna growled inside his head that he damn well better not disappear, that they had things to discuss. With only a tenuous grip on his calm, he rerouted his steps to take him down the hall towards his office and forced himself to stand still before the window through which he had nearly revealed himself before. Merely a handful of minutes later, Azuna stumped in behind him and shut the door, leaving them voluntarily shut into a room together for the very first time. "So my first question is what the hell?" he announced without preamble. Tobirama kept his eyes on the window. "I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. Did you seriously not tell me who you were this entire time just to butter me up?" Tobirama sighed. "I think you've entirely missed the point of the deal that we made." "What, that I wouldn't ask who you were again until I actually wanted to?" In the window glass he could see Azuna's reflection, raising his eyebrows and poking out his bottom lip a little. The expression made him look insufferably adorable. "You wanted me to learn to like you or something first, like a buffer or whatever, right?" "Not quite the way I would have put it, but yes, that was the general idea." Tobirama turned around then, but his eyes fell to the floor. Evidently it didn't make quite as much of a difference as I was hoping for. "Well, what were you hoping for?" Rather than answer verbally, Tobirama felt himself moving before he even realized that something had snapped inside. He was tired of hiding and hesitating. Such things just weren't like him, and he found that he had reached the limit of how long he could hold himself back from simply taking those leaps of faith which had helped him with so many successful experiments in the past. Either Azuna didn't suspect what he was doing, or he was so shocked that he didn't manage to dodge. Whatever the case, he stood perfectly still as Tobirama marched across the room and planted a rough kiss square on his mouth. Tobirama felt the hand that came up to grip his arm in surprise, but he couldn't focus on it. All of his attention centered on lips crushed against his iron. He could have pulled away after a moment, but instead he pressed the advantage of surprise, keeping up the pressure, and even though he knew it was likely to end in violence, he also knew he wasn't going to pull away until Azuna forced him to. He very nearly experienced heart failure when he felt Azuna respond. It was only a slight movement of the lips, just the faintest hint of reciprocation, but it drew a breathy noise from his throat that he didn't have time to be embarrassed about. Finally Azuna seemed to realize what was happening and pulled away to give him a shocked look so dramatic he looked faintly reminiscent of his elder sibling for once. "Ah, okay. Okay, well, I see. That's interesting. I have to go." "Yeah. I have to go." Paler even than earlier, he inched away from Tobirama and scuttled for the door, where he hesitated to look back for a moment and then fled as though all the devils of hell were chasing him. Tobirama touched his fingers to his lips as he stared blankly at the suddenly empty room around him. Something told him that those better reactions he'd been hoping for were a lot closer to true than Azuna would have had him believe, just well hidden. "You can run," he thought tauntingly, "but you can't hide from me, Azuna. Nor from yourself." Rather tellingly, Azuna opted not to reply. Chapter 108, Obito Kakashi, the one where you have the color of their hair on your wrist. If someone were to ask Obito what his soulmate's hair color was, he would likely react with a dramatic rolling of the eyes. How the hell was he supposed to remember what the original color was when it had been changing every few months since before he could remember? His soulmate almost had it down to an exact schedule. Nearly without fail, Obito would wake up on the first of the month, every third month, and the stripe surrounding his wrist would have taken on a different color to signify that someone out there in the world had dyed their hair yet again. It wasn't even an original idea of lots of people dyed their hair just to check when they thought they had found their soulmate, but he thought his so-called other half was taking things just a bit too far. When Obito was 13, his soulmate took a liking to the color red, spending the entire year cycling through different shades from deep ruby to almost orange. The year after that they had swung wildly from purple to yellow before spending half the year trying out different shades of green. It became almost a game between him and his best friend Rin as they took bets with each other on who could guess what color would show up next on his wrist. He never expected it to turn silvery white. In his 19th year, Obito woke up to the scarring on his wrist which signified that his soulmate had passed away, their color removed from his wrist. Barely able to force himself out of bed that morning, he wondered if they had been older than him or younger. Not that it mattered, they would still have been much too young to die. He made it all the way to Rin's house before he started to cry and rage, angry at the world for having taken a part of him away before he ever got the chance to explore it, to love it. His best friend didn't fully understand it hadn't really been all that hard to find Conan with such an uncommon natural shade of hair, but she tried her best to be comforting and he appreciated that. Going on with his life was hard as he tried to get used to the fact that his other half was no longer out there waiting for him. For a long time he relied on his friends to get him out of the house and keep him occupied. It worked for a time until the day when things went wrong. Nearly 4 months after he woke up with a scar upon his wrist, Obito woke up in the hospital with scars in many other places as well. It wasn't his fault that the roads were so icy, but he was just as glad that there had been no one in the car with him when he careened off the bridge. At least no one else had gotten hurt. The hospital was as boring as it was chaotic, despite how that seemed like it should be impossible. He wasn't the only victim of the surprisingly harsh winter, and with the hospital nearly running out of beds, none of the nurses had time to stop and chat with the lonely boys whose grandmother couldn't make the trip across town every day to visit. Eventually he was moved into a shared room with a coma patient whose father did manage to visit every day, and Hatake Sakuma became Obito's only entertainment as his body slowly recovered from the breaks and punches he'd sustained in the accident. In respect for the other boys' privacy, Sakuma never fully opened the curtain which hid his son from sight, but after a few days Obito felt as though he knew Kakashi almost as well as himself. He knew every award that Kakashi had earned at school and in his gymnastics competitions. He knew Kakashi had a mouth on him so smart that he had trouble holding down a job when he continued to sass the customers. He knew about the collapsed building which had nearly taken Kakashi's life, and he knew that Kakashi, like his own soulmate, liked to dye his hair so often that many people had no idea what his original color was. The day before Obito was scheduled to be released into his own dubious care, Sakuma showed up at the hospital with a tearful smile and several cans of colored hairspray. "Hey old man," he called gently. "What's with that face? This is a no-cry zone, remember?" Sakuma chuckled wetly and nodded, setting his bag down and coming over to ruffle Obito's hair. "Ah, you are correct, young one. How rude of me." "Damn right it's rude. You can't just go making rolls and then breaking them yourself. So what's with the woodworks, eh?" Returning to the bag he had set down, Sakuma retrieved several cans of hairspray, one of red, one of black, and another of blue. "It's just a bad day for me, kiddo, that's all. It's been 4 months today since my boy went into the coma, and I suppose I just miss him. They had to cut off all his hair when he came in, but it's finally grown back the way he liked it, and I just thought, he always liked to wear color. Said it would help him find his soulmate someday." "Oh." Nibbling on his lower lip, Obito absently stroked the silvery scar on his wrist. "Yeah, my soulmate used to wear color all the time too." Sakuma raised one eyebrow at him. "Used to? They died. Before we could meet. I woke up one day and all I had was the empty color." He shrugged and tried not to seem too bothered, although the wound was still rawer than the physical ones littering his body. Sakuma frowned sympathetically. "I'm so sorry, young one." Obito shrugged again, eyeing the hair pate with interest. He'd never painted his own hair before, preferring to leave the wild color changes to the stripe on his wrist, and he wondered how he would look with some of that red. Or maybe the blue, he'd always looked good in blue. "Well, let's cheer ourselves up, shall we? Would you like to help? I'll need a steady lookout. Don't think the nurses would take too keenly to me culling up one of their patients." Sakuma offered him a grin that was at least somewhat close to his usual cheer, and Obito returned it tenfold, scrambling over the edge of his bed and using his crutches to stump over and peek out into the hallway. Once he called the all clear, the older man nodded and began to shake up the 3 cans he had chosen. Then he pulled back the privacy curtain all the way for the very first time, and Obito nearly crashed down to the floor in shock. Kakashi had gray-white hair the exact same color as the stripe which ran around Obito's wrist. Sakuma beckoned him over and Obito went, drawn like a magnet to the silvery strands resting like a halo around possibly the most interesting face he'd ever seen. From Sakuma's stories he knew that underneath the eye patch was the empty socket where Kakashi had lost his eye, but the scar above and below it was unexpected. His chin was sharp and his cheekbones fit to cut glass. His skin was so pale it looked nearly see-through. Looking back and forth between them, Obito could definitely see the family resemblance in the two Hatake men. He held his breath as Sakumo raised the black hairspray, combing fingers through the Commodus boy's hair until he had separated a small chunk and isolated just the tips. We never did more than solid dye jobs before. I think you'd love a head full of different colors, don't you? Yeah, Obito breathed, leaning closer. Go on, do it. The older man chuckled at his eagerness and followed orders, letting loose with the spray can to paint the strands between his fingers black. Obito very carefully did not look down. He promised himself that he would not look down until it was over, until he could be sure. Instead, he kept an eye out as he was supposed to, checking the doorway frequently to make sure no one was coming in to disturb them. When he wasn't playing lookout, he was staring at the teenager in the bed with awe. He was beautiful. A little wasted away from lying in a bed for 4 months straight, but still beautiful. Finally, Sakumo set down the last canister and took a step back to admire his handiwork. Only the tips had been painted, but they were a splotchy riot of red, blue, and black with his pretty silver roots shining from underneath. The pillow behind his head would probably need to be thrown out, and his thin hospital gown was also stained beyond salvation, but they had both been sacrificed to a good cause. Well now, I think he'd have enjoyed this. Sakumo traced a slightly blue thumb down Kakashi's cheek. Wouldn't you, son? Yes, you would have liked this very much. Obito took a deep breath, checked the doorway one more time, then steeled his nerves and looked down at his strike before he could stop himself. His gasp drew Sakumo's attention, leaving both of them gaping in shock. Around his wrist, where once there had been nothing but what he took for silver emptiness, there was now a ring of red, blue, and black in equal thirds. He'd been right. Kakashi was his soulmate. He'd been sitting right next to his soulmate for days on end and never ever known. But that's you, Obito, my boy. Sakumo hurried around the bed to engulf him in a hug. My son's soulmate. You, my precious Kakashi's soulmate. I had no idea. Oh, what a story to tell him when he wakes up. Aha. When he wakes up. Obito blinked rapidly to clear his watery eyes as Sakumo pulled away and took hold of his upper arms, meeting his eyes directly. He will wake up. Don't you doubt him for 1 second. He might be the most stubborn person I've ever met and late for almost everything, but he has never let me down before. Kakashi will come back to us, Obito. Okay. He'd never heard his own voice sound quite so small before, but it earned him a second hug, so Obito didn't even think of complaining. The two of them did end up getting scolded by a nurse who came in 5 minutes later and found out what they'd done to Kakashi's hair and the bedding around him. Neither of them could even pretend to be sorry, however, and the woman left in a huff after reprimanding them quite loudly. After she was gone, Obito stumped over on his crutches to sit on the side of Kakashi's bed with Sakumo holding the other boy's hand while Sakumo wrapped an arm around his shoulders, beaming down at him with so much pride he could see echoes of the parents he had lost when he was young. We'll just have to wait right here for him, won't we? Sakumo said. Obito smiled without ever looking away from Kakashi's face. Yeah. Just try and keep me away. He's worth the wait, I promise. You're his dad, you have to say that, Obito teased. Then he bit his lip and whispered, but I bet you're right. And so he waited. Chapter 109, Hashirama Madara, the one where you grow flowers where they are injured. In a drawer in his home, Madara had a box. The box was beautiful, handcrafted of the finest wood, carved and painted with intricate details, creating the scene of a beautiful garden. And inside this box Madara kept a little garden of his own, a single petal from every flower which had ever blossomed on his skin. When he was very young, his mother had given him the box and told him to keep only his most precious possessions within. Inside his box, Madara kept the pieces of Hashirama which belonged only to him. He couldn't truly prove that Hashirama was his soulmate, at least, not yet. Keeping track of the exact locations of Hashirama's wounds was made difficult by the constant movement whenever they battled. Stopping in the middle of a fight to see if the other's cuts and bruises matched up with the blossoms he always found under his clothing after these encounters wasn't exactly smart, either. While he was certain that his old friend would have laid down arms fast, Madara wasn't so certain that the other members of either clan would do so. For most of his life he had made do with only being mostly sure. Now he stood at the edge of a river, eyeing the man standing tall on the opposite bank. Hashirama grinned at him with all the same brilliance as he had when they were children, setting both hands on his hips in exactly the same way, and Madara wondered how he would react to an active Sharingan committing this moment to memory. "I have to admit," Hashirama called across the lazy flow of water. "You kind of surprised me yesterday. I know I keep asking, but you've never shown any signs of accepting peace between us." HMPH, peace was my drain too, remember? "Yeah, but then you hit puberty and you never grew out of your grumpy phase." Madara scowled, not appreciating the teasing at all. "I did not have a grumpy phase. Why did I bother to come speak to you if you are just going to never mind then? I'm leaving." "Ah. No." Madara wait. Ignoring the other man's cries, he turned away and stomped towards the trees. Maybe he should rethink peace if Hashirama was going to be acting like such a classless idiot already. He made it perhaps halfway across the small clearing before Hashirama's feet alighted just behind him and a large hand grabbed his wrist, forcing him to turn back. When he met his old friend's eyes, Hashirama was wiggling his lower lip as though he'd never grown out of childhood. "You wouldn't really leave, would you?" "Well, maybe if you could stop being dumb for 5 seconds I would consider staying," he shot back. "Don't be mean. I was just teasing." HMPH. You can take your teasing and stuff it. When you asked me to meet you I thought you wanted to talk about the treaty, not poke fun at me just because you can now. Letting his pout fall away, Hashirama squeezed the wrist still held in his grasp. "Nah, I just wanted to see you. It's been so long since back then. This is nice, isn't it? Us being friends again." "Who said we were friends again?" Madara grumbled. Over the years he'd forgotten just how open Hashirama was with his emotions and how awkward it always made him feel. He wasn't the best at handling emotions himself. Usually he fell back on covering up his missteps with standoffishness and haughty growling. Luckily for him, Hashirama seemed to have retained the ability to tell when he didn't really mean what he said and plow onwards with a cheerful smile. He was doing so now, chuckling freely and not seeming to notice that he was swaying their linked arms back and forth. Madara put in a good effort to make sure it didn't show on his face how much he wished he could shift his arm and slide the hand on his wrist downward to link their fingers together. Showing such vulnerability when he wasn't sure what the response would be was absolutely unacceptable. He didn't even have irrefutable proof that Hashirama was, in fact, his soulmate, let alone interested in a relationship of some sort. How pathetic of him to wish for such things. "Are we just going to stand around here all day? You're the one who dragged me out here, apparently without any real purpose. Entertain me or something. Do you want to skip rocks?" Madara blinked in surprise. He felt as though he should have expected that, but he truly hadn't. After a few moments of gaping like an idiot, he huffed and grumbled out his acquiescence. Skipping rocks together after all this time actually sounded like a great idea. He wondered if Hashirama was feeling all right to have come up with a true good idea all on his own. Fairly soon they discovered it was only half a good idea, however. With age and experience there wasn't really much of a competition between them anymore to see who could skip their rock the farthest. Although he would never admit it in 100 lifetimes, Madara had spent the last few years skipping rocks across the pond behind his home on the nights when thoughts of the one who got away plagued his mind. His hard work paid off now as every rock that either of them threw made it all the way across the river to disappear among the trees there. In the end they changed their competition to a slightly different game. Hashirama hopped over to the opposite bank and the two of them aimed their rocks for each other to see who could dodge the best and who could aim well enough to hit. No mercy was shown as they pinged rocks off each other's armor, shouting ridiculous battle cries and feeling very much 12 years old again. Madara found himself grinning more freely than he could ever remember. It felt as though a weight he had almost forgotten about were lifted from his shoulders. His mind was empty of all but the feel of another rock in his hand as he listened to his last missile bounce off of Hashirama's shoulder. "Getting slow, old man," he called out tauntingly. "I'm 2 months younger than you," Hashirama protested, hefting another stone of his own. "Take this." By the way he wound his arm back, Madara judged the angle of release to be slightly to his right and dodged accordingly. However, what he failed to take into account was that Hashirama's most common training partner these days was his own brother, and one had to be either fast, tricky, or both to get the upper hand on Tobirama. When the rock flew, it went instead to Madara's left, straight for the space he had only just dodged into. A sharp grunt escaped him as he bent awkwardly, trying not to get hit. His efforts only mostly worked as he felt the pebble slice into the side of his neck with a barely noticeable flash of pain. Right away he could feel a few droplets of blood well up and trickle down, hidden by the tangle of his hair and the high collar of his breastplate. A quick peek across the river told him Hashirama hadn't even noticed that he'd scored a hit. In fact, his friend had twisted his mouth to one side distractedly as he reached up underneath the masses of his own long hair to scratch the side of his neck. Madara's heart nearly stopped when that hand came back out holding several flower blossoms. With a shake of his fingers, Hashirama sent the blossoms fluttering down into the rushing water at his feet like they were little more than a nuisance. Madara watched him in horrified consternation. "What are you doing?" he demanded. His friend shrugged. "It's just a weird side effect from my Mokkiden or something. Flowers grow on me sometimes." "You—" Madara choked on his words briefly and had to take a few deep breaths to calm himself down. "You absolute idiot. Those are soul blossoms. From your bonded getting injured." Hashirama made a thoughtful face. "You think?" "Brother says so too, but sometimes I really do just grow flowers. I guess I'll never know until I find them." Words failed him, leaving Madara to snarl and squeak with inarticulate rage as he stomped across the surface of the water towards the other man. Finally confirming what he had always wanted to know, only to have Hashirama shrug it off as something so blasé as merely some chakra getting a bit out of control, drove him past his tenuous connection to polite behavior. He firmly ignored the squawks of fright, his murderous expression, and him as he stalked right up to Hashirama and took a firm grip on the top edge of his armor. Raising the pebble still in one hand, he pressed it against Hashirama's skin and dug deep. After countless battles facing off against each one, would think he was used to the sight of his own hands drawing out Hashirama's blood, yet Madara still shuddered almost imperceptibly as his fingers left behind a straight cut with the one sharp edge of his skipping stone. He didn't have to check to know that flowers had bloomed on his own cheek. It was evident in the widening of Hashirama's eyes and the brush of silken petals against his skin. Out of habit he dropped his pebble and reached out to free one of the flowers, tucking it safely away inside the pouch at his hip. "Madara, you have flowers on your face," Hashirama breathed in wonder. "Well spotted," he deadpanned in reply. His friend only blinked and continued to stare. "You cut me and then you grew flowers." Scowling, he forced his fingers to let go of the breastplate he was still holding so that he could cross his arms defensively. "They are soul blossoms, you idiot. Because we are soulmates. And poor luck to me for being bonded to someone so stupid." "Hey. You don't have to be mean again, I really didn't know." "Because you're done." "Oh yeah. Well, how about this then?" Not giving Madara any time to guess at what he was doing, Hashirama reached out and dragged him closer to meet each other in a messy kiss that almost entirely missed. Only the corner of their mouths touched, and Madara was scowling even deeper as he wrenched his face away with a healthy blush working its way up onto his face. "That's not how you do it," he shouted. Then before Hashirama could offer any counter-arguments, he mirrored his old friend's move, pulling them together once more. Some smug little part of him noted that his kiss met the mark perfectly. No other thoughts crossed his mind, however, since the rest of him was busy melting and reshaping, every nerve ending in his body sparking with electricity. His skin felt hotter than his hottest Kaiten, but all he wanted was more. A very displeased noise erupted from him like a whining snarl when Hashirama pulled away, gasping for air. Evidently his idiotic soulmate hadn't thought to breathe through his nose. Madara had a lot to teach him, it seemed. "Wow. Can you believe it? We are soulmates. I never even knew, but now I do, and I'm so happy. Madara, we did it. We made peace and now we are soulmates. Aha. Took you long enough to figure it out, you dunce. Hey. Can we do that again?" Hashirama leaned into him with an eager smile. It was incredibly distracting. "Do what?" "Kiss, of course. Let's do it again." Rather than answer, Madara rolled his eyes and huffed for a moment just so the other wouldn't realize how eager he was to take that suggestion. Only then did he deign to lean forward and indulge his pondered, enjoying the way he could feel petals pressing between their cheeks. In a drawer in his home, Madara had a box. And inside this box Madara kept a little garden of his own, a single petal from every flower which had ever blossomed on his skin. With events happening as they were, he couldn't wait to give his box a new home in the village that he would soon build with his soulmate. Maybe if Hashirama didn't piss him off too much he would share his precious treasures. Maybe. Chapter 110, Hashirama, Madara plus Azuna, Tobirama, the one where you are stuck together on first contact. Hashirama left home because he wanted to spend a little time alone, away from his father's oppressive presence and the other clan members who judged him for mourning the death of his brother so openly. He'd never understood why showing emotion was such a bad thing. It made them human. The shinobi habit of pretending there was something more than human had always struck him as pretty stupid. Out here in the woods there was no one to look down on him for letting his feet drag and his lips curve downward as he let memories of his fallen sibling fill his head. Hashirama wandered slowly and without aim, meandering in whatever random direction his feet wanted to take him, and allowed himself the time to work through his emotions at whatever pace felt natural. Slowly the pain began to dull and the morning seemed brighter as he delved into the happier memories. Kawurama would have hated to see him be sad, and it was comforting to think that his smile might bring one to his youngest brother as well, somewhere in the afterlife. It wasn't that long after he had finally settled his emotions that Hashirama came upon a river and a boy. When he first stumbled upon the scene, he was proud of himself for staying quiet enough to remain unnoticed as he observed the one before him. Spiky black hair and well-fitted clothing, tan skin and strong-looking arms, Hashirama had him pegged as a boy from one of the other shinobi clans even before he saw the way the stranger threw his stone across the river. His attempts to skip the stone on the water were foiled by his technique, obviously more used to throwing shuriken instead. Feeling a bit mischievous, he knelt down to pick up his own rock and tossed it just right, fighting down a chuckle with every hop until they both watched it clatter down onto the opposite bank. The other boy turned around slowly to give him a stink eye, obviously unimpressed. "Just aim it a little higher than you'd expect," Hashirama said with a wink. "That's the trick." The other boy stuck out his lower lip imperiously. "I don't need you to tell me that. It will reach the other side if I put my all into it. Who the hell are you anyway? Right now and just your rival at stone skipping." When he grinned he did his best to make it as smug and taunting as his little brother always managed to be. Though mine has already reached the other side. Obviously his self-declared rival didn't take well to being put off like that. Or maybe it was the teasing he took exception to. The scowl on his face deepened with annoyance and he turned around a little more, probably to make sure that his indignation was as visible as possible. It seemed this was a boy who was used to getting his way with others of his own age. "Asked who you are," he yelled. Hashirama did introduce himself, but he made up for the allowance by amusing himself with teasing his new acquaintance mercilessly, throwing in a few bouts of his typical easy depression for good measure. Years of having younger siblings meant that he had a few taunts ready and waiting on the tip of his tongue at a moment's notice, even though the other boy didn't seem to appreciate that. This was just the sort of distraction that Hashirama had needed, so when the other yelled at him to get lost, he turned to leave the other in peace with only grateful thoughts and no regrets. "Wait a second." Hashirama felt a hand land on his shoulder and turned back to jerkingly admonish him for not being clear. Both of them stopped, however, when it became clear that the hand on his shoulder was stuck. Can you not remove your hand?" he asked. The boy stared back at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "No, I can't." "Oh." Everyone knew what that meant and Hashirama stood absolutely still as he waited for it to sink in. When it did, he nearly sent the both of them toppling down to the ground as he leapt and squirmed, unable to contain the sheer joy rocketing through his veins. "My soulmate. That means you're my soulmate. So cool. What's your name, soulmate?" Madara." "I'm Madara." "Awesome." Hashirama nodded on with barely a pause for breath, still squirming and fidgeting until his newly discovered partner started to smack him with the hand he still had free. "Quit moving around. You're pulling me with you, you idiot. Stop it." Madara's words fell on deaf ears. There was simply no reining in an excited Hashirama, as he would come to understand within the next few weeks, and the enthusiastic boy had already gotten himself started. Their voices shouted over each other as Hashirama went on about how happy he was and Madara tried his best to stop his hand from getting torn off. When his elder brother disappeared into the woods surrounding their traditional lands, Tobirama did everything he could to divert his father's attention and keep him busy. He wasn't all that worried. Hashirama just needed a bit of time alone, and Tobirama was more than willing to give him that. Losing Koarama hit all of them fairly hard, so if this was what Hashirama needed, then he counted himself lucky. He'd seen others go mad with grief before. As time slid by and the older boy did not return, however, that was when the worry began to set in. It wasn't like his brother to stay away for this long, especially alone. Hashirama was a social creature. He wasn't usually the one prone to wandering off for an entire day just for a bit of solitude. That was more a habit of Tobirama's. But Suma's attention was easily diverted onto Idama, who agreed to create a distraction with a familiar enthusiasm that made Tobirama roll his eyes. Knowing he would very likely be helping to put out a fire of some sort when he returned, Tobirama slipped away to follow in the direction he'd last felt his big brother's chakra. Stretching his senses told him that Hashirama was stationary by the river which bordered their lands with those of the Uchiha clan, and that there was someone there with him. Putting on an extra burst of speed, Tobirama hurried that way on a straighter path as he could through the twisting trees and rolling landscape of Fire Country. The closer he got, the more he became aware of another signature approaching fast from the opposite direction, and he prayed silently that it was someone friendly. He didn't recognize the stationary chakra at all, but the moving one was ever so slightly familiar. Whoever it was, their name was on the tip of his tongue, but it just wouldn't come to him. Obviously no one too important if he couldn't be bothered to remember them. He arrived with little fanfare, dropping lightly onto a branch with good cover to hide behind and peering out from underneath a leafy bough to assess the situation. Although his brother didn't feel distressed in the slightest, the person with him was definitely giving off feelings of upset. Curious, worried, and sort of hoping that the worst he would find was a little exasperation, Tobirama scanned the scene before him until his eyes landed on Hashirama. Then he was sighing with the desired exasperation as he watched his favorite idiot jump and flail, all while some poor sod that looked about the same age tried to calm him down with a strong grip on one shoulder. Actually, Tobirama realized it looked rather like the stranger was stuck to his brother and getting dragged around instead of following intentionally, almost like when two soulmates meet and touch for the first time. Shifting his position to see just a little bit, he tried to look closer at the hand that was holding on so tightly to Hashirama's shoulder. He knew from experience that keeping such a good grip was nearly impossible when his sibling started bopping around the way he was now. Would he just stop moving? The stranger's voice drifted over to Tobirama's hiding place as he screamed, his voice a perfect mix of exasperation and anger. I can't. I'm excited. We are soulmates. Well, Tobirama mused, that answered that question rather neatly. Knowing that he couldn't be seen, he let the tiniest of smiles appear for just a brief moment, happy that his brother had found his other half and so early in life. Unless one's soulmate resided within the same clan, it wasn't all that common to find them before hitting adolescence. He didn't have much time to languish in the moment, however. A scowl quickly replaced his quicksilver smile as he felt the incoming chakra put on a burst of speed, heading straight for the two boys locked together at the river's edge. The first touch between soulmates would keep them stuck to each other for a few more hours yet, and he vowed silently that he would protect them from any potential harm during that time. Hashirama deserved happiness. They all did, really, but Hashirama had been the one to find it, and Tobirama would do everything in his power to preserve it. Surprise took him when he realized that the person approaching didn't mean to pause and assess the way he had, but to simply burst out and head straight for the other two. His nose scrunched at being forced to reveal himself without knowing what to expect, but he didn't hesitate for a moment before pushing off from his bride and sailing across the river. In his peripheral vision, he noted that Hashirama had finally gone still as he came into view, probably surprised to see him, although most of his concentration stayed on the figure who had just rushed out of the trees opposite of where he had been hiding. As soon as Tobirama spotted him, he had to fight the urge to roll his eyes. Great. Uchiha Azuna was just the person he wanted to see right now. Not. They had only met once before, just long enough to clang their blades together a few times before their patrol units disengaged, but it was all the time he needed to make note of the other boy's face and chakra signature. Not to mention his clan name. Mind working quickly, he saw the way Azuna's body language reacted to the two idiots stacked together and surmised that the other stranger must be a relation of his somehow. Which meant more Uchiha. Wonderful. Tobirama, Izuna spat, dark eyes returning to bore into him suspiciously. Izuna, he mimicked. The other boy never broke their gaze as he raised his voice to speak over Hen. What's going on here, Inai-san, he called. What are you doing hanging out with these Senju dogs? You're a shinobi. You're a Senju. Tobirama did roll his eyes then in despair for the one behind him, disconcerted to see Izuna doing the exact same thing with a long-suffering expression. Apparently he wasn't the only one who had to put up with the insufferable antics of an idiotic older brother. Woi. Inai-san. Don't ignore me. Izuna made as though to step forward and Tobirama narrowed his eyes, protective instincts raising his hackles. It wasn't very likely that Izuna would attack his own brother, but people had been known to do all sorts of crazy things when they discovered huge soul bonds they disapproved of for one stupid reason or another. So when the boy did step forward, Tobirama did so as well. They met in the middle, Tobirama hand clapping down on Izuna's wrist where he had raised it to wave or grab at his sibling or something. Izuna stopped moving, although a well-sharpened kunai appeared in his other hand as though from nowhere, and he glared right back. Let go of me, he demanded in a low voice. Don't touch them. Tobirama paused before sighing. They are soulmates. You couldn't pull them apart right now. Anyway. He watched Izuna's eyes widen and waited until he was certain that the other had taken his news calmly. Only once he was satisfied that Izuna wouldn't resort to violence or any other sort of poor reaction did he let go of the wrist he'd been holding in a vice grip. Or rather, he tried to. At first he thought he might have gotten his fingers tangled in something, but when he peeked down to check there was nothing there to tangle him. Yet when he tried to open his hand again, still nothing happened. It was as though all the muscles in his fingers were locked in place or as though their skin had been glued together. Despite having only just seen this exact same thing happen to two other people, it still took Tobirama a few seconds before it finally occurred to him what was going on. You have got to be kidding me. What? Let go of my arm, you freak. I can't. Izuna scowled at him and tried to shake off his hand. I'm not gonna do anything, so just let go. I can't. Tobirama squeezed both eyes shut with mortification as he heard his brother pipe up from behind them both, his already loud voice amplified with enthusiasm and filling up the entire clearing. Oh my god, Toby. Are you guys soulmates too? What? Izuna gave him a horrified face, seeming to agree with his older brother's shocked exclamation. Tobirama didn't really feel much better about the situation. With a resigned sigh he flopped down onto the gravel at their feet, one hand forcibly held up in the air where it was stuck to Izuna. It would continue to stick there for hours yet, so he might as well get as comfy as possible before all the yelling started. Right on cue, both Hashirama and Madara started screaming over each other, neither of them pausing for breath for even an instant. Hashirama was exclaiming his excitement and happiness that both of them had found their match at the same time on the same day. Madara, on the other hand, was ratting about how this was all stupid and how terrible it was to get stuck with a Senju for a soulmate. Amazingly, when Hashirama crowed that Madara had seemed to like him well enough, Madara actually sounded defensive as he shouted that no he didn't, he'd just been taken off guard. Clearly they were made for each other. They're gonna be at this for ages, Izuna moaned, flopping down next to him. Tobirama eyed him with a great deal of surprise. He seemed to be taking this much better than a moment ago. So what's the plan then? Wait until they exhaust themselves. Inai-san usually goes hoarse after about an hour or so, and then he has to stop yelling. Lucky. Hashirama can go for hours. Tentatively, the two of them grinned with shared humor. Both of them regretted it when just the sight of them getting along even the slightest but set both of their brothers off again at new levels of volume. It was going to be a long few hours until they could all come unstuck. And it was going to be a wild ride indeed, trying to figure out where to go from there once they did. Chapter 111, Kasame is Sakura, the one where you can't lie. Bearing in mind the horror stories which followed the Akatsuki everywhere they went, Sakura considered herself lucky that her situation wasn't worse. Her wrists and ankles were both bound with rope woven through several chakra seals to prevent her from augmenting her strength. She'd been placed in a chair rather than on the stone floor of the cavern, and although she was pretty cold at the moment, she was grateful that they hadn't stripped her as some interrogators would. All in all, her situation was about as good as it could be in these circumstances. There was still numerous places she would rather be than trussed up in a random cave being questioned by Uchiha Itachi while Hoshige Kasame lounged against a nearby wall and ogled her like a particularly tasty cut of beef. Sakura rolled her eyes and tried to shift into a position that pulled on her left arm a little less. Doing so only made the ropes pull on her right arm instead, but it was such a relief that she didn't care. Now if only she could get a relief from Itachi's questions. "Where is he?" Sakura sighed at hearing this again. "If I say I don't know in another language, will you understand me then? Because I think I've told you that I don't know probably about a dozen times by now." Dropping her head back, she glared at the ceiling in boredom. Being captured and interrogated always sounded so dangerous and dramatic when the older shinobi told stories. All this was doing was make her want a nap. The Jinchuriki is imperative. All I want to know is where he was headed. You are his closest friend and he tells you everything. I don't believe he would have left the village and not tell you where he was going. Sakura wasn't about to admit it, but Itachi was right. Naruto would never leave the village without first running around to every single one of his friends for an enthusiastic goodbye. He was like a beam of sunshine determined to shine down on as many people as possible. So yes, she did in fact know exactly when Naruto had been headed and where he was likely to be at this very moment, but that didn't mean she was going to share that information. For obvious reasons, she didn't trust Itachi, and so he would be getting nothing from her. As if she would spill information to the enemy. "This is taking too long," Kasame moaned from where he was reclined against the wall. Lifting her head upright, Sakura just barely caught a flicker of irritation crossing Itachi's face. "Well, why don't you try asking her and see if she'll talk to you then?" Despite the very obvious sarcasm in his tone, that didn't stop Kasame from rising to his feet and wandering over with one hand casually in his pocket, expression making it very clear that he knew he hadn't actually been invited to join, but he planned to anyway. "Right then, girlie," he began with exaggerated cheer, "why don't you just tell us where the Jinchuriki is?" "Because I don't want you to hurt him." Sakura frowned slightly. While that was actually true, she hadn't really meant to say it. It wasn't anything her captors couldn't have surmised on their own, though, so she wasn't all that upset. "Who said we're gonna hurt him?" "No one." It wasn't until she had replied that Sakura realized it was true. Neither one of them had ever so much as implied that they were going to hurt Naruto once they found him. Of course, she thought she could be forgiven for assuming so considering who she was speaking to. Kasame gave her a look which said he was only just coming to the same realization, making her wonder if there wasn't some disparity between the plans each partner had for the fate of Konoha's Jinchuriki. It didn't really matter what their plans were since she was hardly going to help either of them with anything. They were the enemy, plain and simple. Nothing they said would ever change her mind, Sakura was certain of that. "This is boring," Kasame noted. "Interrogation is boring. Come on, girlie, I don't want to waste a week trying to get it out of YA. Where is he?" "He left for Suna to visit the Keisuke, although he might actually be on his way home now." Sakura felt his jaw dropping open in shock only moments before a wave of anger rose up in her chest, all of it directed inwards. Her teeth clenched down on a shriek of frustration and betrayal and, above all, confusion. Why the hell had she just said that? And did she have to be so obvious about her shock over it? That was all the clue her captors needed to know she was telling the truth that time. Huh. Well, that was unexpected. Kasame raised his free hand to rub at the back of his neck while Itachi looked back and forth between them with a very careful expression. Tugging at the bonds keeping her in place, Sakura fumed. "What are you going to do to him?" she demanded. In the corner of her vision she saw Itachi open his mouth, probably to misdirect her or taunt her with a blatant lie, but Kasame beat him to the punch. "Technically we are supposed to bring him back to leader so that his tailed beast can be extracted to further our plans to make a perfect world, but honestly I get the impression that Itachi has other ideas." Kasame's eyes widened, just as surprised as her at his own answer, and he didn't seem able to halt the flow of words that continued to spill out. "I'm not really against it as much as I thought I would be. The Akatsuki seemed like a good idea when I joined, paying for a few to make paradise for the rest, but leader's always been kind of shifty about how the plan is supposed to actually work, so if Itachi thinks there's a different way to go then I'm kind of alright with following along, yeah." "Ah, okay. I didn't mean to say any of that." "Weird. Rubbing at the back of his neck again, Kasame took a hesitant peek backwards at his partner. Itachi was looking back at him more contemplatively than ever. The look in his eye was calculating, and, known genius that he was, he seemed to be running through several different thoughts at once. Kasame shrugged and gave him an unapologetic look. "What can I say?" he murmured. "You pick a horse and you bet on it. Seems to me like you're the one that's gonna go the distance, sir. I think you may have failed to notice something else which you will undoubtedly find important." Itachi blinked slowly but did not move. "This friend of the Ninetales Jinkriki, she appears to be your soulmate if I am not mistaken." "What?" Sakura's jaw dropped open for the second time as her heart rate suddenly skyrocketed. Soulmate. Hers? A member of the Akatsuki. In front of her, Kasame seemed to be having a similar reaction. His head whipped back and forth between partner and captive until finally he settled on staring at the pink-haired young woman being held in place only by the bonds preventing her from infusing chakra. Beady yellow eyes opened as wide as they could as his arms hung awkwardly at his sides, fingers clenching rhythmically. Finally he cleared his throat. "Go on. Ask me something." "Ask you dash." "Okay." Sakura bit her lip. "What do you know about your leader's plan?" "I know that he needs all 9 of the tailed beasts and that he is sealing their essence into something he calls the Gedo statue. Apparently whatever the next step of the plan is needs so much power that only the tailed beasts can help. But once he has them, he says is going to create a world that is perfect for everyone." "You believe that crap?" "Not anymore. I only believed it at the time because I was really upset about the things I was forced to do in my home village, and that the perfect world sounded like a better goal to work for." Kasame wrinkled his nose. "What's with the heavy questions? Making me confess things like that? No fair. I don't have anything embarrassing to ask you." This was quite possibly the weirdest situation Sakura could have ever come up with to find her soulmate in, held captive by 2 men striving for a goal that neither of them really believed in anymore. But, soulmate or not, Sakura still had her priorities. She didn't know this man Kasame, but she did know her friends, and she knew the things she was willing to sacrifice for them. Naruto had a dream for a better world too, but his dream didn't require anyone to die, and that was definitely the plan she was putting her faith behind. Composing herself as well as she could, she raised her chin and met Itachi's eyes. "If you don't want to hurt Naruto, then what to want with him?" She could almost see the exact second when he came to a decision. One moment he was regarding her like a specimen under a microscope, a multiple-choice answer on an academy exam, and the next his eyes held a wary offer of friendship she never would have thought to find here. "Let her free, Kasame. I think her goals align with ours more closely than we all realize. If you're sure." With a shrug, Kasame came forward and tugged her bonds loose with one massive hand. Chakra rushed back into her senses, flooding her limbs, and Sakura flexed her arms in satisfaction at no longer feeling quite so helpless. She was amused to see Kasame eyeing her biceps as she did so. "Feel better, girlie?" he asked her. Sakura snorted. "I have a name and it is not girlie. You just a tiny slip of a thing," he noted. "I'm only calling it like I see it." Looking him up and down as she rose from her chair, stepping back to keep a cautious distance between her and the 2 of them, Sakura flicked one wrist dismissively. "I could put a hole through your skull with one punch," she said. "Now that I would love to say." The sincerity in his voice was as thrilling as it was confusing. Sakura allowed herself a moment to truly look at the man who was apparently her soulmate. Without the worrying threat of what they would do to her, it was easier to realize that he was actually fairly good-looking. His hesitant grin was full of sharp teeth that she really shouldn't find attractive, although, God help her, she really did. His muscles were well-defined, and even standing at full height she would barely come up to his chin. And he wasn't evil. What a strange thing. In her head, the members of the Akatsuki were all inherently evil by association, and it was a strange thought to get used to that they were all just as human as her, their motivations as personal and complicated as any shinobi of the Leaf. Itachi ruined her moment of thought once again as he cleared his throat. Sakura noticed that he had also taken a few steps back to keep a bit of distance from her. "Kasame is right in assuming that I have my own goals which do not quite fit in with those of the Akatsuki. I was 13 when I left the village, and I thought my actions were for the best, but it is time I admitted my own mistakes. Uzumaki Naruto, he is looking for my brother, isn't he? He waited for Sakura to nod slowly before going on. As am I. It's time my brother learned the truth of what happened. And if you desire to know, I will tell you as well. And you? Sakura fixed her gaze on the other man who had, notably, not moved a single inch away. He'd made no move to close the gap she had made when she backed up, but neither had he retreated as his partner had. Kasame gave her an easy grin. I think I'll tag along for a while yet. This all promises to be interesting, if nothing else. Nodding, she leaned back against the wall of the cave behind her, keeping both eyes peeled for any suspicious movements. Start talking then. It was quite a story that unfolded before her, but Sakura was pretty good at compartmentalizing by now. Rather than allow her faith in the village to be rocked at its foundations, she focused on the positive. Those responsible for the past were either dead or very available for punishment. She was confident that Lady Tsunade would have had nothing to do with any of it. And she had found her soulmate, as strange as the match might seem. Only patience would reveal what the future had in store for the two of them. Chapter 112, Kasame Kikuzo, the one where you meet them after the worst day of your life. Kasame had never been one of those people who actively hoped that terrible things would happen to him. Even knowing that he might meet his soulmate as a result wasn't enough for him to wish for something to worsen his already shitty life. Living in Kiridikyo wasn't easy for anyone, civilian or shinobi, and both classes tended to think they had it the worst. Civilians didn't spend their formative years burdened by the knowledge that all the friends they ever made would be dead before adulthood, though, and so Kasame felt like they had less to complain about. Born and bred to be a ruthless killer, it wasn't the deaths that marked the worst day of Kasame's life, although there were indeed plenty. No, what marked the worst day in his life was the complete and total disillusionment with the village he had been raised to be loyal to. Kasame had slaughtered an entire room full of classmates to graduate to the rank of genin. He had performed his first assassination to obtain the rank of chen. An entire village had burned for his promotion to genin. There existed no record of his ascension to Anbu, and he much preferred it that way. By this point he was so inured to death that there was very little thought to each kill, and perhaps he should have been worried about that, but what he found more concerning was that he had done it all, broken his very humanity, for nothing apparently. He didn't have much in this life. He had a shoddy apartment and the clothes on his back, a handful of coins earned from his last mission, and the reassuring weight of a blade in his hands. Kasame had very little to his name, but what he did have was loyalty. Well, he used to have loyalty. The thing about believing in an ideal so strongly that you were willing to bring yourself to the brink of death in defense of it was that, well, once that ideal was taken away, where were you supposed to put your feet? Kasame felt as though he was stumbling in the dark on the day he left Kiridikyo. He had believed in his village, as broken as it was, but to find out about the levels of corruption that led them all had broken a heart he hadn't even known was still beating inside his chest. He wondered for a time. The only time he had ever seen the world was through the lens of a killer stalking his mark, so it was jarring to stop and look around at all the things he'd never noticed before. Flowers, he decided, were a lot prettier when they went fighting their way up through the mushrooms and rot which covered the landscapes of his perpetually damp homeland. Trees were a lot more majestic when they grew more than 10 feet high. Rain was more refreshing when it only fell once in a while. It wasn't too long, however, before his wandering took on a purpose. The figure who approached him introduced himself as Uchiha Madara, and Kasame privately thought that the man must have quite the large ego to take such a name for himself. But what he offered was nothing to shake a stick at. Madara belonged to a group called the Akatsuki, and the more he revealed about their purpose, the more Kasame was glad that he had left his home. Creating the perfect world, no matter that it required a few living sacrifices to do it, that definitely sounded like the kind of thing he wanted to be involved in. The current world was full of lies, but the Akatsuki were determined to make their own truths. Of course the idea appealed to him. What Kasame didn't realize was that the worst day of his life had at long last come to pass, which meant two wondrous things for his future. Firstly, that no day from henceforth could ever be worse. Secondly, probably the more important to most people, he should be meeting his soulmate anytime now. In fact, this realization entirely slipped his mind until he made his way towards the hideout where the rest of the Akatsuki gathered and came face to face with the man himself. Kikuzo was nothing like Kasame would have expected had he actually spent any time wondering what his soulmate looked like. Nearly as tall as himself and covered from head to toe, but for his strangely colored eyes, his body language alone didn't exactly mark him as the approachable type. But the moment their gazes met, they both knew, and it was Kakuzu who addressed the issue first. "After all these years, I assumed you had died in a ditch somewhere." Kasame shrugged and grinned with all of his sharp teeth visible. "What can I say? I guess life's been pretty easy up until now." He wondered what Kakuzu might have gone through recently that qualified as the worst day of his life in order to allow them to meet. The more he learned about the man as they introduced themselves, the less he wanted to know. Apparently he wasn't the only one with a bit of backstory. "So," he drawled after a while, "it sounds like he need a new partner. Preferably someone who isn't so annoying that I kill them. Again. Soulmate or no, if you're annoying like them, I will take your heart too. I'll take those odds." Kasame's grin widened with glee. His entire life had been filled with danger and blood, death and pain. If his soulmate had a penchant for murder, he could hardly blame the universe for pairing them together. Chapter 113, Hashirama Bazuna, the one where you see through their eyes in times of danger. Hashirama wasn't sure whether anyone else realized exactly what had changed. Actually, he was fairly sure his brother understood what happened that day, even if they'd never addressed the issue directly. His assumptions were born of the lingering, vaguely disgusted looks that Tobirama sent him every time the two clans met for peace talks. But since his brother continued to say nothing about it, Hashirama kept his silence as well while he tried to feel out how others might feel about the situation. Very few times in his life had Hashirama experienced the flashes of double vision everyone experienced when their soulmate's life is in danger. Since all of the scenes he'd witnessed had taken place in what appeared to be the midst of different battles, he had assumed two things from such a small amount of information. Hashirama had concluded that his soulmate was a fellow shinobi and also that they must be fairly skilled. If they were a weaker shinobi, then their life would be in peril more often and he would experience the world through their eyes much more. In the midst of battling, Madara yet again wasn't the best time for his vision to split and show him both the world in front of him as well as whatever his soulmate happened to be looking at, but he didn't hesitate to take a good peek at whatever clue he was given anyway. Hashirama certainly hadn't expected to see his own brother bearing down with sword raised and one hand forming a seal which he recognized only barely. It was a new seal, but Hashirama knew exactly what it was meant to do. He also knew exactly who such an action was meant to be taken against, the only person whom Tobirama could possibly be facing if he were revealing such a brand new jutsu in the middle of dozens of Sharingan which could easily record his movements for later study. Surprise attacks never worked a second time, as his sibling was fond of reminding him. Almost before he had consciously worked through the realization of what it all meant, Hashirama was already moving. Lucky thing, too, if he had moved even a fraction of a second later, he would have been the one wearing a sword through his chest. Of course, his armor provided a great deal more protection than the flimsy covering the Uchiha tended to wear, but that wasn't the point. Tobirama blistered the air around him with curses as he wrenched his blade to the side at the very last moment, eyes widening upon realizing that his brother was now standing before him rather than his enemy. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded in a voice pitched maybe a single octave too high, almost squeaky with panic. Hashirama very generously did not point that out. "The fighting needs to stop," Hashirama said. "This needs to stop once and for all. Peace is an option if we could all just talk for 5 minutes. So go flap your lips at Madara. Don't jump in front of my blade. Spirits above, Anija, I nearly ran you through." Admittedly, he did feel a little bad about that. He hadn't meant to scare Tobirama. But it was worth it to turn around and see Azuna standing there, his sword still raised and his body still held in a defensive stance, eyes wary, but alive. For a few seconds Hashirama allowed himself to just look, taking in the younger man's appearance in a way he'd never bothered to before. It was only for a few seconds, however, and he was quick to acknowledge Madara when his old friend landed close by. Madara hurried to place himself in front of his own sibling, and Hashirama thought that was rather nice. How could anyone say the two clans had nothing in common when it was so obvious how human they all were? Didn't all of them have only one goal, to protect their precious people? Achieving that goal would be so much easier for everyone if they all just stopped trying to kill each other. Madara took a surprisingly short amount of time to capitulate after so many years of refusing his pleas for a ceasefire. There was a moment when Hashirama thought Izuna might speak up and try to sway his brother, but the younger man hesitated, and that brief pause was all that was needed. For the first time in countless generations, the Uchiha and Senju clan heads had brought their hands together in a gesture of harmony. The peace talks were both delightful and torturous. Hashirama wondered how no one but Tobirama seemed to pick up on how eager he was for each and every glimpse he could catch of Izuna. On the days Izuna joined them for their councils, Hashirama found his tongue stumbling and tying itself in knots more often than usual, causing him to worry that his soulmate might start to think him stupid. It was surprising how little Izuna contributed even on the days he shadowed his older brother. For the most part he sat in his chair and watched the Senju party with cautious eyes, sometimes taking notes but never sharing them, only rarely murmuring something in Madara's ear and never addressing anyone else directly. Only once a treaty had been hammered out, the village had been built, and both of their clans had moved in did he slowly begin to speak to a few members of the Senju clan. At first he mostly spoke to Tuka, the two of them striking up a rapid friendship, and made no effort to hide the fact that he was flat out avoiding Tobirama. Eventually, however, he did begin to speak to Hashirama on occasion, leaving Hashirama a jittering mess of nerves every time. Since Tobirama obviously didn't want to talk about it and no one else knew, Hashirama spent a lot of his free time taking long walks by himself and blathering away to the forest trees, asking their silent opinions. Had he been too eager that day? Should he have worded his question differently? Would Izuna think him even stupider now? Yet as time went on, the two of them realized that they actually got along fairly well. When he didn't have his hackles up suspecting an attack from someone he wasn't comfortable with, Izuna had a bright energy and an easy smile that he used to charm whomever he happened to need something from. It didn't take long before he figured out that Hashirama generally capitulated to his suggestions after just one smile. Obviously he didn't understand why, but that didn't stop him from taking advantage of it every so often. Not enough to say that he was abusing a discovered power, but definitely enough to make it clear that he knew he was a favorite of Hashirama's for one reason or another, and not ashamed to play it up on occasion. Hashirama knew that's what Izuna was doing in his office today, using that pretty face of his to bug a favor from the newly elected Hokage. Even knowing he was being cheerfully played didn't help him find the strength to care. Just seeing that smile flash so easily and only for him was more than worth a few concessions. At least, in his book it was. We can definitely have someone look into finding a merchant that carries those ingredients. I wasn't aware that Uchiha cuisine was so different from our own. Maybe someday I will get the chance to taste some of your traditional dishes. Realizing how that sounded as though he were trying to imply something, Hashirama sank down in his chair with red creeping up his face. Not to say yours in particular, just as a general term. I only meant what I mean is I should do some of this paperwork now. I'm sure I know what you meant, Izuna cut in with a teasing voice. That's good. Slumping a bit more in relief, Hashirama let his own easy smile shine through while trying to fight back the blush. When exactly he had started to develop a crush on Izuna, he had no idea. Knowing the exact date wouldn't have helped him anyway, so he didn't waste much energy wondering too hard about it. Once he'd managed to get a little control over his face, he parted his lips to say something, but paused when he noticed the contemplative look Izuna was wearing. Is something wrong? He asked. Why are you so nice to me? I'm nice to everyone. Hashirama chuckled to himself a little. If one listened to Tobirama's opinion, then he was too nice to everyone, too ready to forgive slights or insults that would have messed others up in arms. Being angry was just so much work. True, but you're extra nice to me. I don't really mean much to anything, so it doesn't make any sense. Izuna cocked a hip and tilted his head. I'm not clan head, so you can't gain any political advantage from me. Nii-san is the one you've been chasing after all these years, and you call him your best friend, but you don't do him half the favors that you do for me. Hashirama scratched at one ear bashfully. Am I that obvious about it? The question was more of a dodge for time than anything else. He was perfectly aware that his affections had always been the most obvious thing in the world. It's kind of hard to miss, Izuna told him. I keep trying to figure out why, but honestly nothing comes to mind. Well, it's just that is, you might not believe me if I tell you. Sort of hard to either believe or not believe if you never tell me. The younger man lifted one eyebrow and gave him a humorous look. So what is it then, Hokage-sama? I'm quite curious. Ah. That is, I discovered some time ago that we are, soulmates. For the first few seconds Hashirama thought Azuna might not have heard him. There was no reaction at first until gradually those dark eyes widened and his lip parted with shock, jaw gaping open while his arms dropped down to hang uselessly at his sides. Hashirama waved both of his hands in the air as though warding off some kind of negative reaction or a denial which hadn't even been said. Not that I expect anything. You never seemed to like me much until the last few months, so I know this probably isn't anything you expected. Or wanted. I was never sure how to tell you or if you would even want to know, so I always thought maybe if you ever considered me even a friend I might find a way to say something, but... Breathe. Izuna's voice cut him off suddenly, startling him into silence. He took a deep breath through his nose like he'd been asked to, realizing that he was indeed fairly winded from speaking so rapidly. Sorry, Hashirama squeaked out. Don't apologize, just are you sure? Full of nervous energy, Hashirama pushed his chair back and hopped to his feet, scooting around the desk so he could shuffle up and poke Azuna in the chest. Very sure. Here's where Tobirama almost stabbed you. Right here. I saw him through your eyes. So that's why you stopped him that day. Oh. Yeah. Well, I sort of moved to stop him before really thinking about it. But I'm glad that I did. Because it led to the peace you've been chasing for so long, right? Well, that too, yes. But I meant I'm glad because it gave me the chance to get to know you. If he had the courage to, he would have spilled out all of his thoughts on why he thought Azuna was an amazing person and how well they would go together. Izuna was bright and cheery for those that he got along with, a bubbly person who was always ready to have some fun or explore something new. Their energy and enthusiasm would work so well together. Both of them were smart in a more understated way than their siblings. Not to mention just how attractive Hashirama found him to be. Where most Uchiha had smooth locks of glossy black and Madara somehow ended up with the wildest hair anyone had ever seen, Izuna was a perfect middle ground to them both, with his perpetually slightly mussed hair tied back in an elegant ponytail. His eyes had a habit of sparkling with silent laughter, and Hashirama secretly loved the fact that he was shorter than average. If they stood close enough, he could have tapped Izuna right up underneath his chin. As much as he would have loved for his destined other half to be excited to finally find him, Hashirama could definitely understand the skepticism still hovering on the face staring back at him. That scene on the battlefield was quite infamous by now, and it wasn't too far-fetched for an Uchiha to be wary of a Senju making up stories. I wish there was some way to prove it, Izuna mumbled to himself. Hashirama beamed at him. There is. Of course there was. All he had to do was be in mortal danger, and Izuna would obtain double vision, seen through his eyes for a moment. It was such a simple solution that he wondered how he hadn't come up with it himself in the first place. Pulling aside the robes his council had designed for him when he took office, Hashirama dipped his hand into the holster strapped to his leg and pulled out a kunai. Then without hesitation he turned it around and aimed it at his own chest. Later he would hear several lectures from multiple different people about how careless he was with his own life. Only Izuna's reflexes, as lightning fast as most shinobis, saved his life from spilling out across the floor of the Hoku's office. Barely a few millimeters before the blade would have pierced him, his arm was jerked to a stop as Izuna clamped down on his wrist with one hand, his eyes glowing wide again. Panic colored his features for a moment, swiftly followed by the anger that comes when one has been truly scared. You idiot! What are you trying to do? Well, you wanted proof. I didn't say you had to stab yourself. Did it work? Hashirama ignored the worry for now, packing away that memory to be examined and swooned over later. For now he concentrated on whether or not his plan had been enough, because he was willing to go to much further lengths if that was what it took to convince his soulmate that they were, indeed, soulmates. Izuna mumbled quietly, "You were really going to hurt yourself?" "Of course. I had to be in mortal danger, you know. It wouldn't have worked if I was only pretending. Crazy madman." "Yes, it worked. I saw myself through your eyes." "Which means, oh wow." Beaming again, Hashirama held as still as possible and hoped that Izuna wouldn't realize yet that they were still touching. His wrist was tingling and warm where their skin met, probably just an imagined sensation, but enjoyable all the same. Disappointment rushed through him when the grip on his arm loosened, only to be replaced by a thrill when Azuna didn't let go entirely, only lowered both of their arms to hang between them more naturally rather than hovering awkwardly in the air. He wanted to say something to reassure Azuna that he didn't really expect anything, but the words just wouldn't come. It was difficult because the truth was that, while he really wasn't expecting anything, he did want it. We are really soulmates. Poor Azuna looked as though he'd been hit by a ton of bricks. Aha. Trying very hard not to swing their hands like two adolescent children, Hashirama waited as patiently as he was capable of for how his other half would react. What he got was not what he expected, although he definitely had no qualms with it. Some kind of garbled noise of surprise escaped him when the fingers around his wrist tightened again and tugged, pulling him down as Azuna pushed upward onto his toes. He fell utterly silent when their lips met, eyes squeezed shut in case this wasn't real, trying to keep the hallucination alive for as long as possible. Calmly above, Azuna tasted good. The kiss was soft, slow, and everything he could have imagined it would be. Already pretty lost in the moment, Hashirama very nearly squealed with audible delight when Azuna lost his balance and caught himself on Hashirama's chest, pressing them together ever so slightly. On instinct he reached out to wrap his free arm around Azuna's waist and pull him closer. Then he instantly regretted doing so, as it seemed to remind the younger man of what exactly he was doing. Very slowly they pulled apart and Azuna blinked up at him, bemused. Well, I didn't really mean to do that. Oh. Hashirama bit down on his bottom lip. I can pretend you didn't if you want. I get the impression you would do anything I wanted. Suddenly Azuna was smirking, eyes twinkling as he watched Hashirama swallow thickly around a tongue that suddenly seemed too large inside his mouth. Tugging at his collar and trying not to sweat inside his robes, Hashirama tried desperately to seem less panicky than he felt at the moment. Not anything. I mean, there's limits, you know. Okay, so yes, maybe I do give you a little more leeway than most people, but it's not a big deal. I'd just like you. A normal amount. Not, excessively or a lot or anything creepy that might weed you out, and I should stop talking now. You kind of cute when you ramble. Azuna did his best to remain nonchalant while Hashirama gaped at him, willfully ignoring the color rising in his cheeks. I think I would be interested to see where this could go. Considering how long they'd known each other by now, he really should have seen the hug coming. Apparently he didn't, however, as he let out a wheeze of startled laughter when Hashirama caught him up in a tight embrace and spun him in a circle, spouting exclamations of joy. Filled to the brim with more emotion than he felt any human would be capable of handling, Hashirama spilled his happiness out into the room with laughter and blinding smiles. When he set Azuna back on his feet, he held their bodies close together, thrilled when Azuna allowed the embrace. Then he bent down to kiss him again just because he could. Because they were going to see where this could go. Because they were soulmates. And maybe also because he was going to need to butter Azuna up before voicing the suggestion that they kind of owed Tobirama for helping them find each other. Chapter 114, Shisui in Naruto, the one where the sunrise illuminates the last place they touched you. Shisui had always been a fan of the dawn hours, even if he didn't know who his soulmate was yet. In his opinion, there was no greater beauty in nature than the slow breaking of the sun over the horizon, the gradual lightening as the dark of night peacefully gave way to the morning. The colors were always pretty, and the first sweet notes of birdsong never failed to start his day off in a wonderful mood. If there was one thing he thought could have made dawn any better, it would have been the presence of the person he'd been wanting to spend all of his time with lately. Unfortunately, Naruto was the opposite of a morning person and remained largely oblivious to Shisui's flourishing crush. Actually, he seemed oblivious to any and all crushes on him, despite the fact that nowadays one would be hard-pressed to find a young girl or boy who didn't at least flash him a look of admiration every time he passed by. Being the village hero should have been great for Naruto's dating life, and yet as far as anyone knew, he never accepted any of the numerous offers he received. Leaning back on his palms and settling himself more comfortably atop the village water tower, Shisui allowed himself a wistful sigh. As much as he hated to be predictable, he had definitely been just as caught up as everyone else, crushing on the great Uzumaki Naruto from afar without a hope in hell of those feelings ever being returned. At the very least, he didn't have to crush from all that far away, since they happened to be friends with a great many of the same people. In fact, he would have gone so far as to say they were friends themselves by this point, although he definitely wouldn't have presumed to say that he was one of Naruto's closest, most precious people. That honor stayed firmly with those of the group colloquially known as the Konoha 11, all from the same graduating class and most of whom had made Jonin after the war was over. Tilting his head back, Shisui grinned widely upon spotting the first hint of light in the sky above him. He was so lost in his own head, content and at ease in his morning rituals, that he almost didn't notice the chakra signature slowly ambling its way up the side of the tower. When a head of blonde hair peeked over the side, he only just barely managed not to start with fright. Naruto. He examined the shambling beast in front of him with a great deal of surprise. It's like 5 in the morning, what are you doing up at this time? The young man in question cracked his jaw on a yawn and flopped down on the top of the reservoir. You're always going on about how great this is, Tebaya. Wanted to come see for myself. Better be good or else I got out of bed for nothing. Shisui watched his friend slowly melt into his position where he had sprawled on his belly, smiling to himself and resisting the urge to brush his fingers through blonde spiky hair. It's great, I promise. He got no more than a grumble in reply but didn't let it bother him. Naruto was notoriously not a morning person, preferring to stay up late and sleep until almost noon. Shisui had always been aware that he was sort of an outlier for getting up so early voluntarily, but it never bothered him much. It was amusing to watch all the hopeful couples dotting the village, hands linked as they waited for the first rays of the sun to touch them and show them if they were as meant to be together as they hoped. His favorites were the couples that leapt into each other's arms and celebrated loud enough to wake the neighbors. A sudden snort gave him a little start, and Shisui realized that while he'd been thinking about couples and love, his hand, the naughty thing, had wandered over to stroke Naruto's cheek. He bit his lip as the blonde fought his way out of the lingering clutches of sleep, looking over at him with an adorably confused expression. You had something on your face, he lied. Naruto grunted. Where's the sun? Petulant whining shouldn't sound so adorable, but by Kami he somehow managed it. It's there, Shisui answered, pointing to the east where a strip of gold was showing above the tree line. Give it a few more minutes and it should reach us soon. Mumbling under his breath about possibly outlawing mornings when he eventually became Hokage, Naruto managed to sit up with only a medium amount of effort. Considering how tired he looked, Shisui mentally applauded him for the grace he was exhibiting. At least he wasn't drooling. Then all that effort went out the window as he fell backwards and had to take a quick grip on Shisui's arm to keep himself from plummeting down to the ground below. Once settled, the two of them sat calmly together, eyes on the sky to watch the dawn as it heralded the beginning of another day. Shisui pointed out the color gradients to a tired Naruto, who grumbled reluctantly that they were indeed very pretty. As the sun peeked its head up to greet the world, the shadows rolled back inch by inch and Shisui closed his eyes to greet the light when it fell upon him at last. He hummed with satisfaction in the back of his throat, another daily ritual successfully completed. Then he turned his head to peek over at Naruto, lips parting with the intention of asking him what he thought of the sunrise he'd gone to so much trouble just to wake up and see. He froze before the question could ever leave his mouth. Naruto's cheek was glowing. It looked as though diamonds were hidden under his skin, giving the sun-darkened cheek a tiny strip of silvery overlay that glittered distractingly, standing out quite obviously from the rest of him. When Naruto realized he was being stared at, he looked back at Shisui with a questioning face and a grunt of confusion. What's the matter? He asked, words slurring together. I got something on my face. Yes, Shisui replied honestly. He lifted an arm to point, but Naruto never followed his finger, gaze stuck on his forearm instead. Holy shit, your arm is all spackly. Shisui looked down to see that Naruto was correct. The spot on his arm where the younger had gripped him was lit up with the same silvery glare he had just been gaping at. The two of them stared at each other's spots for a few moments, dumbfounded, until finally the shine began to fade. Only the very first rays of sunlight each day revealed the place your soulmate last touched you, and already the moment was quickly passing. Neither of them were able to pull their eyes away until both of their skin had returned to normal. Then they met each other's gazes as the silence stretched. It was Naruto who broke it first. Does that make you like my soulmate or something? Yes, Shisui breathed. We are soulmates. He could hardly believe it even as the words left his mouth. Silence fell back into the minuscule amount of space between them, filling it up and leaving Shisui to grow more and more tense as the seconds ticked by. Doubt trickled into his mind until he began to question if maybe Naruto was disappointed to find out they were matched. Could he have had his eye on someone else already? Is that okay? When he finally spoke up, Naruto's voice was impossibly small. Shisui blinked in surprise. What do you mean okay? Just that I've got a demon fox inside me and I'm pretty loud and I know I'm not the smartest guy. Like, I'm not stupid. I know I'm pretty popular right now, but that's fake stuff that they're like me for, and they are all the same people that hated me before they even knew me anyway. You're a really cool guy and okay, don't laugh, but I sort of have a crush on you. So I would totally get if you were disappointed that it's just me who ends up being your soulmate. Naruto. Shisui had to call over his companion's voice to get him to stop talking. That was, wow. I'm not disappointed, okay? I think you're amazing. Really? Really? Nodding slowly, Naruto suddenly broke out into a wide grin. Cool. And I sort of have a crush on you too. What? But... you... does that mean I can kiss you? Shisui blinked rapidly a few times and hoped he never woke up from this amazing fever dream. A wild laugh escaped him before he could manage to whisper, yes please. Naruto launched himself into Shisui's arms, who caught him and held him tightly as their mouths slaughtered together for an incredibly uncoordinated first kiss. It was messy and a bit wet, and Shisui nearly swooned when he realized that it didn't seem like Naruto had ever kissed anyone before. Was this why he was never seen out on any dates before? Could he have been waiting until he found his soulmate? It was a sappy idea, yet it sounded just like him. Above their heads the sun continued to rise, illuminating another day and waking the birds in the forest to rise and sing out in joyous chorus. None of them, however, could match the joy in Shisui's heart as he clung tightly to his newly discovered perfect other half. This was definitely worth waking up for, Databeya. Shisui couldn't help but agree. Chapter 115, Shikaku and Minado, the one where you feel their emotions. The Nara were a clan known for their genius, and Shikaku was no different, a shining example of every stereotype ever perpetuated about his clan. He had yet to meet a puzzle he couldn't solve, and so the mystery of his soulmate hadn't even been a particularly hard puzzle. Even a child could have solved that one. Konoha's rising star was sort of hard to miss. From his bright personality to the brilliant yellow of his hair, Namikaze's Minado was about as subtle with his emotions as a punch to the face. Unless he wanted to be, of course. The lad was allowed to go on S-class missions for a reason. He was a damn good shinobi. Being a true product of his clan meant that Shikaku shared all the typical traits, good and bad, so it was no surprise to anyone that he much preferred to take his time about things. He'd figured out that Minado was his soulmate about 2 years ago, but only lately had he begun to roll around the idea that he should maybe inform the other of this development. Minado was 18 to Shikaku's 20 and starting to show signs of looking for someone to fall in love with, even if they weren't his soulmate. The friendship he had developed with Uzumaki Kushina was growing closer and more intimate with every day. Shikaku figured he should probably say something before things got too far. His other half deserved to make an informed choice, after all. That was a neat trick he pulled today, Namikaze, he mumbled, taking a drag of his cigarette before stubbing it out under his boot. His mission partner gave him a smile fit to light up an entire room, and Shikaku felt that special place just under his breastbone grow warm with borrowed pride. Minado must really have been touched by the compliment for him to be able to feel it too. It wasn't much. Minado rubbed at the back of his head with one hand. I've been working on it for a while now. The jutsu isn't complete yet, though. When it is, I'm gonna call it the Rasengan, and it's gonna be amazing. I don't doubt that. Lounging back against the tree they were sitting in, munching on a handful of soldier pills each in place of an actual lunch, the two of them remained silent for a few more minutes while Shikaku tried to plan out the best way to bring up the subject. Just springing it on the other man unexpectedly might scare him off or something. Genius though he might be, Shikaku had never been a fan of situations that needed delicate handling. Do most Nara not feel things really intensely, or is that just you? Shikaku blinked, nonplussed. What do you mean? It's just, I rarely ever feel very much from you, and I wondered if that was because you have really good control over your emotions or if it's just a Klein thing. You never feel much from me. Oh, did you not know that we are soulmates? Since when do you know? Shikako had to stop himself from gaping at the younger man, completely taken aback. He quickly began to comb back through his memories to see if there had ever been some sort of indication that Minato knew about their connection. Nothing jumped out at him, and that was incredibly surprising. How could someone like him miss all the signs? Minato offered him an easy smile and a breezy laugh, one which had earned him several date offers that he never seemed to accept. Shikako had never thought to question why. Like everyone else, he'd been taken in by the genuineness of that laugh. How fun, I can feel your surprise. It wasn't all that hard to figure out, really. Just because you rarely ever show extreme emotions doesn't mean it never happens. Just my luck, I usually happened to be around during those times so I could make the connection. Well, I'll be damned. Shikako leaned back against the tree and simply stared blankly at his companion for a minute or so. Minato looked back without a hint of smugness in that genial expression, only the faint curiosity which had driven him to ask his question in the first place. When it became clear that he wouldn't be getting any answer until Shikako had worked through a few thoughts inside his head, Minato shrugged. Perhaps we should be getting back. If you like, maybe we can talk about this more later. Over dinner. His smile as he leapt down from the branch they were resting on was all cheek this time. Shikako watched him go, unable to move at first, until gradually he began to shake his head from side to side in amused bewilderment. Never in 100 years would he have guessed that Minato had figured it all out already. Yet, he realized that he should have guessed it. After all, the Nara clan weren't the only geniuses in Konoha. Leaping gracefully after his soulmate, Shikako began to strategize for their dinner tonight. Something this important definitely required a good game plan, especially since he couldn't tell if the mounting excitement he was feeling belonged to himself, to Minato, or to both. Chapter 116, Minato Madara, the one where you can't injure your soulmate. Having studied the Uzumaki sealing techniques extensively, Minato was absolutely sure that he should have been trapped within the belly of the Shinigami at this very moment rather than waking up in a sunny room with the window wide open and a pleasant breeze drifting across his face. Sitting up slowly revealed no gaping hole through his midsection where he was positive the Kyuubi had impaled him. Curious, suspicious, and incredibly wary, he peeled back the covers and slipped out of the hospital bed he had been tucked into. Whoever had put him here had dressed him in a sleek yukata of an incredibly outdated cut, something his own grandfather might have considered fashionable way back in his youth. It was thick and warm, however, even if he felt a little exposed without his uniform and weapons. A quick search of the room revealed his personal effects were not present, which was disappointing. Nevertheless, he had expected as much. It looked as though he would be exploring in the outfit he was wearing. Peeking his head out the door revealed no one in the hallway, so Minato crept out and made his way through the quiet hospital, which he now realized wasn't quite as familiar as he'd first thought it to be. The walls were wooden with no plaster or paint. Beneath his feet the floors were not covered in vinyl or linoleum but were also crafted from wood so smooth it might have grown in that shape. Minato stepped ladder, more and more unsure of his location by the minute. Several of the rooms he peeked into were occupied, yet he saw none of the traditional hospital equipment one would expect to find, no heart monitors or the new beds which had been installed recently with automatic controls to lift and lower the mattresses. Instead, all he found was simple frames, most of them with archaic leather restraints still attached as though he had somehow stepped backwards through time. Overall, the effect was creepy and he couldn't wait to figure out where the hell this was so he could get back to Konoha. Minato's steps paused and his head thudded painfully in his chest. He leaned against the closest wall as he fought for air that seemed to disappear between 1 second and the next. Konoha. Until yesterday, the thought of home had evoked thoughts of his loving wife and unborn child. Now all he could think of was how warm Kushina's blood had been against his skin, how pale her skin had looked as she made her final goodbyes, how very small their child had been. If all had gone as planned, then Naruto now had the demon fox sealed away within his belly, and Kushina, spirit's rest her soul, would have gone to her final rest. He himself should have been sealed away as well, and yet here he was having a panic attack in what appeared to be unfamiliar territory. Tightening the muscles in his jaw, Minato forced himself to get a grip. Breakdowns could come later. Right now he needed to concentrate on finding his bearings as well as locating both clothes and weapons. Keeping his breathing tightly controlled, he pushed away from the wall and continued on down the hallway. When he reached the end and descended the stairway, he found that it took him to a much more populated floor where he was forced to employ all the subtle skills of a good shinobi. He blended into the shadows and disappeared, avoiding all human contact, making his way out of the building entirely undetected. As soon as he stepped outside, he found that the buildings tugged at his memory as well. It was almost as though he knew this place, but it had been distorted somehow and he couldn't quite put his finger on what the difference was or why he should recognize it. Blending in with the shadows still, he observed the citizens passing by and tried to identify his location using any clues they could provide: local fashion, skin tone, dialect, anything at all. What he discovered was that this village must have been frozen in time to still have some of these things so common amongst themselves and still be using such outdated modes of speech, but their accents were indisputably Fire Nation. Wherever he was, they should be his allies. Minato was only just starting to calm down when he scaled the side of the hospital building he had escaped from and used the roof as a higher vantage point to observe from. What he saw from there made his heart freeze inside his chest. The last time he checked, there had been 3 faces carved into the side of that mountain. Looking back on the day he had arrived in the era of his forefathers, Minato was eventually able to laugh at himself for his own wild reaction to discovering that he had somehow fallen through time, although there were still times when he had to stop and sit down, almost unable to wrap his head around it all. Losing his family and everyone he knew in one fell swoop was a blow that took time to recover from. Amazingly, he did so with the help of the 3 founders of Konoha themselves. Hashirama was the easiest to get along with, a boisterous, enthusiastic man who on a good day was a welcome reminder of Kushina's personality. While he didn't quite have the fire or her penchant for getting into trouble, he did have the same charmingly childlike wonder in his eyes when he looked out at the world around him. Tobirama, though intimidating at first with his immovable stone face, became a greater friend than Minato could ever have imagined. He was incredibly knowledgeable about seals and jutsu theory, unsurprising considering he had invented many of the staple jutsu which would later be taught in the academy, and they whiled away many an afternoon in theoretical discussions so deep it sometimes baffled even Mida and Uzumaki, who had studied seals her entire life. Minato did tend to make himself scarce when Tobirama got that experimenting look on his face, though. He was smart enough not to get involved in any of that. Although it baffled him as to why, it was Madara to whom Minato found himself most drawn of the 3. The man had hardly been welcoming when they first met, and it took quite some time before they warmed up to each other. Being friends with Madara was rather like herding a cat without trying to startle it or let it know what you were up to. Pinning him down to spend time with you was difficult enough, and the moment he caught wind of the slightest sign of affection, he was gone again, as though he'd never been there. How Hashirama managed to catch him for so many hugs was a mystery when both Minato and Tobirama could move faster, and neither of them managed to lay so much as a hand on him, even just for a pat on the back. But an aversion to touch wasn't such an unusual habit for a shinobi in Minato's own time, let alone now when they were only a few years past a generations-long war, decades upon decades of trusting no one but your own family. So Minato didn't think much of it until it had been 3 years to the day since he had arrived here, and suddenly it was Madara seeking him out for once. Spar with me. Long used to Madara's abrupt ways, Minato hardly took offense to what might have sounded like a demand if he had no better. That right there was as good as a please. Has little Kakami been bothering you to train with Tobirama again? He asked. Madara snorted and brushed by him, allowing their sleeves to touch for the barest of seconds. I thought a distraction was in order. And that, in Madara's taciturn way of communicating, meant that he knew what day it was today and was trying to help the only way he knew how. He was trying to take Minato's mind off of things by occupying his mind with a fight. Something deep in Minato's chest flooded with affection for this socially challenged human disaster. Were he being truthful, Minato could have admitted that he was actually doing just fine today. Getting over the loss of his wife and child had been hard, that was true, but knowing that Naruto was safe from harm and that Kushina had gone on to a better place meant that he had slowly been able to make his peace with where he was now. But he certainly wasn't about to say any of that to Madara right now. To do so would ruin this rare opportunity of Madara seeking someone else out for a bit of human interaction, and that was a chance too good to give up. Together the two of them made their way towards the nearest training grounds with purposeful steps. Madara went everywhere with purposeful steps, never a fan of lackadaisical wandering. Upon reaching the field, he immediately began to stretch, as all shinobi should before a training session, and Minato couldn't help but admire the sight. He couldn't remember ever seeing Madara spar with anyone other than Hashirama in the 3 years since he had arrived here, the Shodan Hokage being the only person who Madara saw as a worthy challenge. Being allowed to watch was a great honor all on its own. Madara taking the initiative to ask him to partake was nearly beyond comprehension. Rules, the Uchiha grunted. Minato blinked. It seemed he was being offered many honors today. 1 point per connecting blow. First to 10 points or to force their opponent to yield. Acceptable. Madara tilted his head to one side. You are faster than Tobirama, he noted. Minato hesitated, not wishing to downplay his friend's abilities but also incredibly proud of his adjustments to the Hiraishin which had fascinated even their inventor himself. Eventually he admitted, some might say that. I wish to test my skills against yours. Let us see which triumphs, your speed or my strength. Smiling at the formal speech cadences which still amused him on occasion, Minato agreed with a simple nod of his head. After finishing their stretches they stepped into position and fell into ready stances. Barely a single heartbeat had passed before Madara murmured for them to begin, pulling forward straight away for a frontal attack. Minato wouldn't have made it to Hokage if he hadn't been able to hold his own in taijutsu, however, and their clash ended in nothing more than several blocks and a couple of near misses. They sprang apart again as it became clear that neither would gain the upper hand so easily. Strangely, Minato found himself reluctant to use his specially marked kunai so early in the game. He could have danced around the field faster than the blinking of an eye, but he wanted to see how this would play out without such things first. Hopefully Madara would be up for round 2 afterwards so he could truly make an effort to impress. He got the feeling rather quickly that Madara was feeling him out, ramping up the pace only gradually to test his abilities bit by bit, and the idea rankled. All 3 of the founding trio knew the truth of his story. They all knew that he'd been named the 4th Hokage of Konohadakyo. There was no need to treat him like a child in training. A little insulted, it was him that threw the first jutsu. Madara dodged his now completed version of the Rasengan, though only barely, and responded with a thin stream of fire that heated the air around them both. For a moment Minato thought he'd been hit, but he felt no burns and spun back with a triumphant smirk. Once they had both crossed into that territory, it was free reign, anything goes. Jutsu exploded at every turn yet never seemed to connect. Frequent bouts of taijutsu left them both frustrated as neither of them seemed able to land a blow. When Minato finally did feel something against his cheek, he marveled that a titan such as Uchiha Madara could hit with so little force. It seemed that Madara himself was also startled by how ineffectual his punch had been, and the surprise of it was enough of a distraction that he left himself wide open. Minato took that opening on pure instinct, rearing back and putting the full force of his weight behind a blow straight to the center of Madara's face. Nothing happened. Both of them stood there blinking at each other, completely still, their fight having been paused by the harmless tap of Minato's fist against Madara's nose. What should have been a blow that sent him rolling across the field and shattered his nasal cavity had instead done nothing but squish the tip of his nose into his face a bit. Minato frowned. He hadn't held back at all, knew he'd felt the muscles in his body extend to make impact, and yet nothing had happened. Fascinating, Madara rumbled under his breath. But I hit you, Minato said, a little lost. His opponent tilted his head to one side. It did not hurt. Oh sweet Kami. Eyes widening, Minato dropped his arm at last and stumbled back. But that would you my soulmate. Madara reached up to rub his nose, somehow managing to make even that simple gesture appear idle. Yes, I rather thought that might be the case. His words left Minato stiff with shock. You what? You knew. How could you possibly know? He expected neither the extremely serious look that appeared in Madara's eyes nor the way it would cause his knees to weaken. Considering how much effort it took just to become friends with the man, Minato had never allowed himself the chance to admire Madara as anything more. Suddenly it was all he could think of. I feel myself around you. Had you not come into our lives, I think I should not have been as content in my days as I am now. One genial word from you brings to me a calm I had not felt since my brother's death, and I know that without your influence I could never have borne Tobirama's presence in the village, could never have come to terms with his actions. Rather than look at all embarrassed by his words, Madara's expression only intensified as he stepped forward. You have effects on my person which I could only attest to one possibility. I knew you must be my soulmate. Somewhere deep in the back of his mind, like an echo of the past he was still working to leave behind, Minato thought he could almost hear Kushina's voice whispering in his ear. Ridiculously, he was hearing her say he's so hot for you. Which, admittedly, did sound like something she would say. But he could also hear her whispering that it was time to move on and take a chance. Reaching for the future didn't necessarily have to mean letting go of the past. He had loved his wife and he would always love the son for whom he had been willing to give his life, but that didn't mean he couldn't let anyone else into his heart, especially if that someone new happened to be his soulmate. A surprisingly romantic soulmate, it would seem. Forcing himself to take a deep, calming breath, Minato allowed his eyes to fall down and drag his gaze back up the length of Madara's body, inch by inch, taking everything in while his thoughts rushed forward nearly as fast as his famed jutsu. His soulmate stood a mere foot away without any indication of closing the remaining gap, politely allowing him that choice. If I were to be honest, he said slowly, I never got the impression that you thought me more than tolerable. Which, to be fair, was still quite an achievement when it came to the man in question. Madara lifted one eyebrow. Then I shall work to be more obvious about my affections in the future. I had thought myself to be perfectly clear. You disappeared halfway through our conversation just 3 days ago without telling me what I had done wrong, Minato pointed out. He received a quiet huff in response. When you spoke of your admiration for certain curry-wrought weaponry, I left to bring you a piece from my own collection. Upon my return I discovered you were no longer present, and I am not in the habit of chasing those who are so impatient as to not wait more than half a minute. Minato couldn't help it, he smiled. One of these days I'm going to help Hashirama trap you for a nice long conversation about polite social interactions. No, his tone was dark enough to scare small children, but Minato had sharp eyes. He could see the minute twitch at the corner of Madara's lips. He'd made the man smile. Well, his version of it, anyway. You don't think I could do it? He asked, sidling ever so slightly closer. Correct. Nothing could make me suffer through such ridiculousness. What if I let you hold my hand the whole time? As he spoke, Minato reached out and slipped his fingers into Madara's palm, thrilled to see dark eyes widen in surprise. For someone as touch-starved as Madara, to hold hands probably seemed like an incredibly intimate action. And just as Minato suspected, it rendered him completely immobile. With both of their pasts taken into account, it was pretty much a given that the two of them would need to take baby steps as a couple exploring their new relationship. Looking at the hint of color rising up on Madara's cheeks, however, Minato thought to himself that he was rather looking forward to it all. However he had ended up in the past didn't truly matter. What did matter was the chance for happiness quite literally dangling at his fingertips. He intended to take that chance. Chapter 117, Hinata Sakura, the one where everyone has wings and your colors match your soulmates. Like everyone else in the Hyuga clan, Hinata had been dyeing her wings since they first developed their colors. It was a safety measure. Her father told her to stop enemies from being able to use her potential soulmate against her. As she grew older, Hinata realized the truth in her own time. It wasn't truly a safety measure for her. It was a barrier set in place to protect the purity of her clan's bloodlines. She realized this truth the same day she finally opened her eyes to see the beautiful gilded cage she had placidly allowed herself to be locked within, as had every other true child of the Hyuga. It was also the day she met her soulmate for the very first time. The first day of her first year in the academy was as exciting as she had always dreamed it would be. Many of the children had never met before, sheltered until now in their own clan compounds, all living in the civilian district and having no contact with the shinobi-born children. Hinata was fascinated to see each new display as several of her classmates presented at first sight of their soulmate, the muted shades of their wings suddenly blooming into bold colors. She took note of each and every one of them until the sight of one such presentation threatened to shatter the poor beaten heart inside her tiny chest. At a single glance, the girl wasn't much different from the others. Her pink hair was distinctive and perfectly matched to the bold streaks of pink and deep purple along the edges of both half-grown wings. What set her apart was the look of delighted hopefulness that slowly turned to broken despair when no one else stepped forward to meet her and show off their similar coloring. Hinata watched the hope drain from the poor girl's eyes and felt a stone settle in her stomach. She wasn't the only clan child who dyed their wings, but she realized suddenly that even her earliest memories could not recall what colors had been disguised beneath plain matte gray. Haruno Sakura, as she later learned was the girl's name, made it through the rest of her day with a shell-shocked expression, barely seeming to notice the sideways glances she was getting from her classmates. Presenting without a match was unheard of. Lying in bed that night, Hinata carefully stroked the soft feathers of her own wing and wondered what colors were hidden there, wondering if someday she would meet her own soulmate, only to leave them as sad and broken as that girl Sakura had looked. It was a terrible thought, and it kept her up for hours before she fell into a restless sleep. She woke in the morning with both wings wrapped around her like a protective cocoon, almost hoping she could stay there forever and not have to face the real world outside. Something about that girl Sakura pulled at Hinata's attention again and again as they grew up together over the next few years. Although they eventually ended up as friends once Hinata was able to push past her own shyness and introduce herself, they certainly couldn't have been said to be best friends. Both of them spent most of their time with their assigned teams after graduating the academy, and when she wasn't training, Sakura gravitated more towards their other old classmate Ina. The two of them were so close and so boisterous that the very idea of trying to wedge herself in next to them was frightening. Hinata contented herself with watching from afar, admiring the warmth yet afraid to get burned. It took war and distraction and more lust than any village should ever suffer for Hinata to finally find her courage and her destiny. As each of the shinobi villages reeled in the after effects of the war, the citizens of Konoha clung to each other tighter than ever as a means of convincing themselves that they had all survived. Hinata saw more of Sakura in a week than she might have before in a month, and with each conversation a new warmth grew inside her chest. 7 months after the inauguration of the 6th Hokage, Hinata's father told her there would probably be some changes around Konoha and that he intended for the Hyuga clan to remain as much like they always had as possible. When he told her he intended to find her a husband, one who will make a proper heir of Yu, as Neja would have wanted, it was like she could feel the door to her cage closing once again when she hadn't even realized the lock had slipped. Any protests she had about this not being what Neja wanted, what she wanted, fell on deaf ears. The next evening, when one of her household servants came to reapply the dye to her wings, Hinata sent the girl away. Waiting until the rest of her family was asleep, she brought a lantern down to the bathing pools and a bottle of special shampoo she had purchased one day in a rash of bravery. It was now or never. Deep gray lather coated her wings from base to tip, foam dripping from the long-hidden feathers. Hinata refused to look at the color until she was certain that all of the dye had been washed away and the shampoo rinsed off. As soon as she caught sight of her colors, she began to cry. By the time dawn broke in the morning, Hinata was already up and out of her family compound, beyond the reach of her father, where he could not stop her from doing what she desperately hoped she had the courage to do. Unlike the rest of their group of friends, Sakura lived in the newly constructed civilian district with her parents, and Hinata spent a half hour standing at the end of their street, watching the sun come up, while she wrung her hands together and tried to plan out what she was going to say. In the end, all of her hastily thrown together plans were for naught. Sakura, as unpredictable as ever, came tumbling out of her second-story window with a smile and an over-the-shoulder wave before Hinata could declare herself entirely ready. The moment her friend spotted her, she froze in the air, wings continuing to beat behind her more due to physiological instinct than conscious thought. Very slowly she lowered herself until her feet touched the road, and Hinata trembled as she shyly extended her own appendages. Bands of pink and purple shone brightly along the lower half of her wings, the top half a beautiful glossy black. She noted in the back of her mind that the colors matched perfectly to the shades of both their hair, but it was a fleeting thought, unimportant as she waited to see how her friend would react to this new development. Sakura took a long time to speak. For impossibly long minutes she stood halfway down the street in silence, just staring with an inscrutable expression. Very likely she was going back over all the years she had spent alone, thinking she had no soulmate, wondering why her other half only chose to reveal herself now. At long last she met Hinata's eyes. "Did you know?" she asked, barely loud enough to be heard. Hinata shook her head frantically. "No. If I had, I never would have hidden it. I promise." Silently nodding to herself, Sakura slowly closed the distance between them. When they stood toe-to-toe, she reached out to run her fingers against the soft feathers of Hinata's left wing, a smile touching her lips at last as they trembled under her touch. "They look wonderful on you," she said. "Oh, Hinata flashed, her eyes dropping down to one side. I think yours look very nice on you. Why, Hinata, are you calling me pretty? Yes, her voice came out as a squeak, and she was certain her entire face was about to burn off from such an intense blush, but the word come out with almost no hesitation, and she was proud of herself for it. Fingers tucked underneath her chin and lifted it back up until she reluctantly met Sakura's green eyes with her own. She wasn't at all prepared for a soft pair of lips to press themselves ever so gently against her own. It felt as though the heat in her face was rushing through the rest of her body in a fiery wave, leaving her stunned and gasping in the aftermath. When Sakura pulled away, she was wearing the most brilliant smile Hinata had ever seen, and both of their wings had extended in an instinctive display of color. I've always thought you were beautiful, Sakura told her. Even when you didn't think so yourself. Hinata giggled nervously, fighting against the urge to hide her face away behind both hands. You've always dyed your wings. What made you go against your clan's traditions? My father. Her wings folded slowly behind her as memories of what Hayasha had told her the night before sapped away some of the joy of this moment. He wants to arrange a marriage for me, and I just had to know. Shanara. He can't do that without your permission. We won't let him. Feeling safer than she ever had before, Hinata smiled so widely it forced her eyes to close and made her fingertips tingle. Then she gave a startled jump when Sakura leaned forward to kiss her a second time. Strong hands found hers to weave their fingers together, and Hinata lamented that it had taken her so long to show her true self. They could have had this years ago. How different would both their lives have been, she wondered, if only she had been brave enough to ask questions when she was little. When they parted this time, Sakura squeezed both of her hands before dropping them and stepping away to flutter her wings. Come on, she said. If anyone knows how to get around your father's demands with as little mess as possible, it'll be Shikamaru. He might be lazy, but he's a political whiz. Let's go wake him up. In the next moment, her wings were kicking up dust as they lifted her body from the ground, as graceful as she had ever been. Hinata allowed herself a moment to simply watch and appreciate her soulmate's beauty before she hurried to take off as well. Together they set off across the rooftops towards the Naruto compound, and Hinata found that she had something now that she'd never had before, something about herself that she could always be proud of. She couldn't wait to show the world her true colors. Chapter 118, Kakashi Batacha, the one where you have a red thread on your wrist. The first time Itachi noticed the string around his wrist, it was almost too late. With the situation surrounding his people rapidly coming to a boiling point, the loss of Shisui was very nearly the event which would have pushed him over the edge to accept Shimo Danza's crazy plan. Instead, it became the event which saved them all. Watching his best friend tear out his own eye and cast himself to an inevitable death over a waterfall awoke the mythical formation of his Sharingan known as the Mangekyo Sharingan. On his way back home from that grisly scene, his legs wanting to stumble even as his pride wouldn't let them, Itachi saw something with those new eyes for the very first time which changed his entire life. He saw a pretty red string tied around his wrist. Red strings of fate were as much fable and myth as the Mangekyo eye, probably because the two legends were intertwined. It was said that those who possessed the special formation of the Sharingan could see the strings of fate which connected the people of the world with their destined soulmates. Itachi allowed his faltering steps to slowly come to a halt as he stared at his wrist. The string was tight enough that it would never move from the thinnest part of the joint, but not so tight as to dig into the skin or cut off circulation. From the knot there extended a string which drooped along the ground as though he had dropped a ball of yarn and let it roll away from himself. The trail led out of sight of where his eyes could see. Shaken by what he had just witnessed, aware that he couldn't trust even his only family to go to for help, Itachi figured he had no better options than to follow the pretty red string and see where it would lead him. It could hardly hurt anything, really. His family was staging a coup against the very village they were sworn to defend, an attempt to overthrow the Hokage they had pledged to serve. Finding out whether this legend was as true as the one which now spun in both of his eyes couldn't possibly make anything much worse. Most of the village slept on as Itachi wound his way through the streets, his eyes on the ground to follow the trail of his string. Each step had his heart beating faster and faster until it seemed likely enough that someone 3 villages away might feel the thrum of it pounding against his ribs. Just as he started to wonder if he would ever reach the end, his string took a sharp turn and ran up a set of stairs outside one of the many identical apartment blocks used for Jainin housing. He followed it up to the topmost floor and along the balcony outside of the apartments until it wound its way under a window he had perched himself upon many times over the last few months. That was most definitely Kakashi-senpai's window. Itachi took a deep breath, trying to stay calm and forcing himself to think rationally. Just because the string was going inside of the copy ninja's apartment didn't mean it led to him specifically. He might have had company. Either way, it was the middle of the night and Itachi was fairly sure that Kakashi-senpai would not appreciate being woken up at this hour regardless of whether or not he had someone inside with him. For a few minutes he simply stood there and waffled back and forth, unable to decide what to do. The polite thing would be to leave and come back at a more reasonable time, but if he did that then he ran the risk of whoever was on the other end of his string leaving before he returned. If that happened, he would need to start his search all over again if they even remained inside the village. On the other hand, he could stake out Kakashi-senpai's apartment and wait for morning, but that seemed a little creepy and it came with a high chance of getting caught. His team captain had some damn good senses. It was unlikely that he would go all night unaware that he was being observed. As was proven when a flat voice spoke from just behind him only a few moments later. "Did you need something, Kohai?" Itachi spun around to see Kakashi hanging from the edge of the rooftop which covered the walkway. When he looked down, the string no longer led through the window, but he was too nervous to look around for it any more than that. Instead, he looked back to his team captain. "Yes, I needed to speak with you." He only barely refrained from wincing at how awkwardly suspicious those pauses had sounded. Kakashi's one eye narrowed at him before the older team flipped down into the walkway to stand beside him. "All right. Go on then." "Right. Well, just..." Kakashi waited for perhaps 20 seconds before prompting him, "You just..." But Itachi had no idea how to even begin explaining himself. The Red String of Fate was an Uchiha legend and it was a toss-up whether Kakashi had even heard of it before. If he hadn't, then he would have every right to believe that Itachi was making the whole thing up. His captain was guarded like that, very reluctant to grant his trust and easily suspicious even once he did. And even if he could explain the reason which led him here, he himself had very little idea of why he had come. What was he hoping for? He was only 13 years old and already a member of an organization of assassins. A lifetime romance was hardly one of his main life goals at this point. It did sound nice though. Even without the romantic implications, the idea of a soulmate sounded like a dream. Someone whom he could trust implicitly, someone who would always care for him, someone he could turn to in his darkest moments and reveal his deepest secrets to without fear. It sounded like a civilian's airheaded fantasy. He could make it his reality if only he could open his mouth and say something. "Senpai, you have a Sharingan yourself. Have you heard of the Mangekyo Sharingan?" Forcing himself to meet his captain's gaze head-on, he watched Kakashi nod slowly. "Yes," he said shortly. "Have you by chance heard of the legend of the Red String of Fate?" By the lack of surprise in Kakashi's eye when Itachi activated the new form of his own Sharingan, it was obvious that he had indeed heard the legends. It was equally obvious that he immediately understood why Itachi had come to him that night. Very slowly all the tense muscles in his body relaxed, one by one, and when Itachi dropped his gaze to the string connecting their wrists, Kakashi's eyes followed despite knowing he would see nothing there. The breath that caught in Itachi's chest as he finally confirmed what he'd suspected he would see there was enough. Before either of their cautious personalities could take over and send one of them running for the hills, Kakashi tentatively gestured towards his front door. "I could make tea," he offered. Unable to find any words, Itachi simply nodded in answer. Tea with his soulmate sounded absolutely wonderful. It sounded like something to live for. Chapter 119, Shikamaru wa Sakura, the one where you share a limited stack of sticky nights. Sometimes it occurred to Sakura to wonder where the sticky notes came from. Were they made of trees like real paper? Could they be recycled and made into new products with the same properties? These were questions which would forever go unanswered, of course, because she had absolutely no intention of ever ruining any of the notes she had received from her soulmate over the years. Each one of them was tucked away and kept safe in a box underneath her floorboards, a secret hoard to cheer her up on the days when it felt as though she might never find them. When she was younger, Sakura had considered blatantly asking who and where they were instead of relying on any accidental hints like everyone else did. Until then they had only communicated by sending each other small childish doodles, conversing in the only way they knew how until both of them learned to write. Her first lessons in letters, however, came with a warning from her academy teachers. As a future shinobi, it would endanger the village to give away their location, not to mention cause possible conflicts if it turned out their soulmates were loyal to a village Konoha was currently at war with. Sakura went home that night with angry tears in her eyes and threw her little stack of sticky notes against the wall. What good was it being able to talk to them if she might never get to meet them? What good was it to love someone you could never be with? Over the years as she grew older, Sakura came to understand the practicality of it, like all shinobi do. She still didn't like it, but it was rather telling that her soulmate never asked for any information about her either. Somewhere out there in the world was another shinobi whose soul was bound to hers. She did manage to pick up a few small hints, though. Her soulmate seemed fairly laid back and offered smart advice to any vague questions she asked, so they were probably intelligent. He said something about a ponytail once, and she only called him he out of some vague instinct that his speech pattern seemed more masculine than feminine. Honestly, she would have been fine either way. As most people did, Sakura failed to pay attention to just how often she used her sticky notes until one day she realized that there were only a handful left. That was when it finally hit home that this was it, the last few times she would ever be able to communicate with her other half, and then she might never find them again. After spending several days crying for lost opportunities and ignoring Inopi's questions about what was getting her so down, Sakura finally sent a note to her soulmate, cramped writing squeezing into the limited space. It was the fifth last note she would ever send in. I only have a few more of these left. If we never find each other, then I want you to know I will never forget you. We've never met, but I think I love you. Later that day she found a sticky note pressed to the door of her fridge, professing the same sentiments. It was as succinctly worded as they usually were, yet there was so much emotion in that short sentence that Sakura couldn't help breaking down in tears all over again. She was glad right then that she had finally moved out on her own so that no one could see the absolute disaster she had made of herself, propped up against her kitchen cupboards with salt cresting on her cheeks and a pale yellow square of paper clutched tightly like a precious jewel. Sakura wished she could say that she had enough patience to wait and use her last few notes for something truly important, but in reality she squandered them just as she had squandered the rest, sending pointless messages just so some strange man out there in the world would know that she was thinking of him. Over the years ahead of them, she hoped that he would never think she had stopped thinking of him. She was absolutely sure that she never would. On the day her last sticky note was sent, it held nothing more momentous than a single carefully inked word, goodbye. As soon as her pen lifted with the intention of having finished her note, the paper disappeared from beneath her fingers as though it had never been there. At some point during the day it would appear before her other half and carry to him perhaps the last words she would ever have the chance to say to him. That day passed almost painfully slow. When Naruto came by and found her with a dark cloud over her head, he retreated to a safe distance down the road before sending out a clone to fetch the big guns. Ino, when she arrived, marched into Sakura's apartment as though she belonged there more than its occupant. There were protests, insults, and sharply spoken words. None of it swayed Ino from her determination to see Sakura up off the couch and out of her funk. Only one of those goals was accomplished. An hour later found Sakura at the cafe 2 blocks over, surrounded by chattering friends. She didn't particularly feel like socializing at the moment, and luckily Ino seemed satisfied with her lack of escape attempts, deeming that enough of a win for now. With a heavy sigh, Sakura closed her eyes and let herself fall sideways onto whoever it was that had happened to sit next to her. From the faint scent of cigarette smoke, she would have guessed Shikamaru. Her genius friend said nothing about being made into a leaning post, allowing her to peacefully drift in and out between the present moment and her own rose thought. She remained undisturbed until the entire table lit up with enthusiastic catcalls and someone jolted her perch from the opposite side. Go on, Shikamaru, read it. Sakura cracked one eye open to see that there was a pale yellow sticky note stacked to Shikamaru's shochu glass. A wave of pain ripped through her and she stubbornly closed her eyes again, unable to stand even the sight of someone else's happiness when hers was already a lost opportunity. Oddly, she could feel a light tremble in her friend's body as he reached for the note awaiting hen. What's it say? She heard Ino demand, probably leaning across the table to try and sneak a glance for herself. Shikamaru's breath stirred the hair on top of Sakura's head. Not much, it just says goodbye, he murmured quietly. Sakura's eyes flew open again at the same time Naruto snorted. The hell? Naruto, don't. Shikamaru was shaking his head, an unfathomably sad expression caught in the lines of his frown. I don't know who she is. But this is the last of her stack. I knew it was coming soon, but look, do you guys mind if I go? Suddenly I'm not in the mood for drinks. He slid out from underneath a paralyzed Sakura's weight and excused himself without waiting for an answer. Everyone else broke out in muted gossip the second his back was turned, passing worried questions back and forth about whether he was going to be okay or not. Pushing herself upright, Sakura forced herself to lift her head and look at the note Shikamaru had left behind. Black ink on pale yellow paper, her own handwriting stared back at her. She was scrambling out of her seat before she had even fully processed what it all meant, barreling out of the cafe and ignoring the startled shouts of the friends she left behind. Once she was out on the street, she looked in both directions frantically, catching sight of a high ponytail as it went around a corner a couple dozen feet away, and took off running in that direction. As soon as she had him in her sights again, she was crying out for him to stop and wait. Shikamaru paused and looked over his shoulder at her, irritated and sad and obviously just wanting to be alone. Her news couldn't wait, however. Shika, wait. Your note. I don't want to talk about it, all right? No, it was from me. You what? Shikamaru stared at her as Sakura came to a skidding halt, almost crashing into his chest before frantically digging through her hip pouch. After a few heart-pounding seconds, she came back up with a square of paper neatly folded in half and cat lovingly free of any other wrinkles. When she thrust it into his hands, he had it open almost before her fingers had let go. Then he stared at the words inside, no doubt marveling at his own handwriting the same way that she had. You my soulmate, he said quietly. Sakura trembled. Yeah. Any other words were lost to the quivering of her fingers, the catch of breath in her throat. Shikamaru looked up at her with his dark eyes shining brightly. All this time you've been right here. Sakura opened her mouth to make some reply, probably something as speechlessly halting as before, but she wasn't given time to say much of anything. Before she could do more than draw a breath, Shikamaru had his arms around his waist and his lips pressed to her own. His kiss was clumsy, a little awkward, but it was warm and real, and it belonged to her. It was her first kiss with her soulmate. To her, it was perfect. Chapter 120, Izuna Tuka, the one where you know when your eyes first meet. For as long as Izuna could remember, he had always had one opponent when his own clan met with the Senju in battle, and although he would never admit to it out loud, his reasons for facing Tobirama were similar to the reasons that his brother faced off against Hashirama each time. Should the two evenly matched pairs ever split apart and find others to fight, there would be carnage on both sides. There were few who could hope to match any of the titans from either the Uchiha or Senju ranks. Which is why it had been so strange for Izuna to scan the battlefield before him and realize that Tobirama was nowhere to be found. Strange, but not truly a bad thing. If the Senju wished to leave themselves open to slaughter, then he was more than willing to oblige them. His legs were coiled and a mere instant away from launching himself towards a pocket of Yondu-looking fighters harassing a lesser clan member when he was stopped by a woman placing herself squarely in front of him. Izuna cocked an eyebrow and gave the stranger a quick once-over. She was old enough that there was little chance she didn't know who he was, so he had to give her credit for having the bravery to face him. Whether she thought she could take him or if she only meant to give her own life to slow him down for a while, he didn't care, but either way he made a snap decision to oblige her. A smirk crossed his face as she took a stance, sharp naginata leveled at his chest. This promised to be fun. She was taller than him, if only barely, and carried enough muscle that he would have called her body delicious if she'd come from his own clan, and just the idea of finding any of the Senju attractive was almost enough to put him off his footing. Izuna quickly shook the thought away and activated his eyes in the hopes of putting the stranger off of her game just to equal the playing field. Instead, the woman raised her chin and rather deliberately met his eyes straight on. There wasn't time to be impressed, although he really kind of was. As soon as their eyes met, it felt as though the Earth's gravity was shifting and pulling him somehow forwards rather than down. Izuna and the Senju woman stared at each other in startled awe, almost completely forgetting about the battle going on around them until he watched her instinctively tilt her head to one side to avoid a stray kunai. He noticed that her movements were economical and sharp, no energy wasted on trying to look fancy or move more than was absolutely necessary. To his detriment, it was her that recovered first from the shock. With a smoke to rival the smugness of his own, the woman stepped forward and swept one foot across his ankles, tumbling him backwards onto his ass before he could gather his wits enough to dodge. All the breath wished out of him at once as his back cracked against the dirt, and then he froze, held in place by a blade against his neck. The woman slowly winked one eye at him from where she stood haloed by the sun above them. "How interesting," she murmured. Izuna could feel his heart thundering against his ribs. "And Hira thought you were supposed to be some kind of amazing fighter. Toads goes on and on about how he can never beat you, but it took me less than a minute to dump you on your ass. I'll have to make sure to rub this in his face when he gets home." "I was just distracted," Izuna insisted, trying very hard to pretend that wasn't a whine he could hear in his own voice. The look she gave him was almost patronizing, and he really shouldn't have found that so attractive. "Does it matter? You're still in the dirt and at my mercy." Now that he should probably not have found attractive, but damn it, he really, truly did. Izuna swallowed thickly, wincing when the movement pressed his throat more tightly against the blade pressing into his skin. Then he listened, entranced, to the sharp laughter the action earned him. "Seems I've wasted enough of your time. My cousin appears to be calling the retreat. Fly away now, little Uchiha, back to your nest with the rest of your carrion." With that she lifted the blade and turned her back. If she were even an ounce less confident in her own abilities, he was sure she would never have done so. Or maybe, he mused wryly, she was just that confident in how dumb he'd been rendered at the discovery of his own soulmate. He scrambled frantically to his feet and called out to her before she'd taken more than a few steps away. "Your name," he blurted. "Tell me your name." She gave him a brief assessing look over one shoulder, feet paused in mid-step. "I'm not in the habit of following the orders of any Uchiha vulture. Even the cute ones who turn out to be my soulmate." One eyebrow arched and then she was gone, pushing off the ground to quit the field with the rest of her brethren. Izuna slumped back down to the ground with a slack jaw and his blood pounding in his ears. She was amazing. He'd only known her for however little time it had taken for their two patrol squads to clash and immediately retreat, but he could already say with absolute confidence that she was the most amazing woman he'd ever met. Nervously, he wondered what her impression of him had been. Ikako was already wearing a tired expression when he touched down at his cousin's side. The younger man's ponytail was loose and dripping, blood smeared across one of his cheeks, and there was a familiar slump to his shoulders which said he was already exasperated before he'd even asked what happened. Hilting his sword, he looked Izuna up and down with a critical eye. Then he crossed his arms and sighed. "You want to explain to me how some nobody sent you got the drop on you so easily?" "She isn't just some nobody," Izuna breathed in reverence. "She's my soulmate." Hikaku stared at him in surprise for a moment before clapping a hand over his eyes. A quiet groan escaped the poor man. "Of course your soulmate is a senju. Of course. Your brother is not going to like this at all, and I hope you know that I will not be the one to tell him." Throwing up both hands, he walked away grumbling under his breath. "Just let her knock your feet right out from under you. Didn't even try to stop it. Idiot. How we've kept you alive for so many years is beyond me." Used to his uptight cousin's ways, Izuna had already stopped listening before Hikaku even finished turning around. He was too busy gazing off in the direction the senju disappeared with a transcendent expression on his face. Next time that two clients met, he would definitely be keeping an eye out for a beautifully muscled woman who drew him in like she was the center of his own personal gravity field. And even if it was the last thing he ever did, he would learn her name. If it had to be the last word on his dying breath, he would learn it. He might have known her for less than 10 minutes, but Izuna knew one thing for certain. This was love. Chapter 121, Madara Tobarama, the one where their emotions are written on your wrist. Madara picked up the habit of wearing gloves when he was 15 years old. It wasn't so much a desire to protect his hands, already calloused by years of holding various blades, as it was a desire to protect the nebulous being out there in the world somewhere. It was a personal decision that his soulmate had felt enough pain without the world knowing about it for hours afterward. Madara wore gloves to cover the letters on the back of his left wrist which displayed the most recent strong emotion his soulmate had experienced, already weary of seeing the word pain written there so often. Covering the area did nothing to stop himself from peeking underneath several times a day. Each time he'd flared in his wrist, Madara took a moment to peek under the hem of his glove, smiling or frowning as the word changed. His favorite was seeing excitement stamped across his skin for hours at a time. It became a favorite game of his to try and guess at what his soulmate could be doing. No matter the various words that came and went, his least favorite remained bearing the word pain. It worried him trying to guess what kind of hurt his other half could be experiencing. Was it emotional pain or physical? It happened frequently enough that it could just be the typical injuries of a shinobi's life, but it could also be a civilian in an abusive situation. Madara had spent hours agonizing over what the exact difference was between pain and hurt and whether he should worry for them or not. He was 25 years old when he discovered his soulmate in a manner most unexpected. Battle was not a time for him to be paying attention to things like his soul stamp. On the rare occasion that he even happened to notice it changing while he was engaged in battle, he tended to ignore it. He ignored it now, barely even registered it as he watched his baby brother come within a single inch of losing his life. Standing as still as a frozen rabbit, Izuna stared at the blade which had come to a perfect halt less than an inch from his eyes, aborting the motion that could just as easily have run him through. Across the field, Madara heaved a breath and stumbled forward on shaking legs. His brother was all he had left. To come so close to losing the younger man was enough to shake him, mind and body, like he had never been shaken before. In that moment it mattered very little to him why Tobirama had spared Izuna's life, only that he had. The Senju had already lowered his blade by the time Madara made his way there to drag his sibling into his arms and hold him tightly. And by the time Madara looked up, Tobirama had already turned away, willingly showing his back to his two greatest enemies and brushing past his own brother without so much as an explanation. "This would be your chance to offer peace," Madara heard him say in a dry tone. Hashirama was startled, but he wasted little time following that advice, offering his hand in friendship and peace as he had so many times before. What made this time different was in the way Madara watched Tobirama walking away, his sword sheathed without having tasted Izuna's blood, and saw the rekindling of his childhood dreams. Accepting Hashirama's hand felt as momentous as he'd always thought it might, and yet, stupidly, he found he could not keep his concentration on the man before him. Madara's eyes slipped away to roam over the Senju forces, gathering behind their leader with a motley collection of reactions to what was happening. No matter how he looked, he could not spot Tobirama again. It should have been easy considering the man's culling, yet no white hair remained beyond an elderly Senju woman still incredibly spry for her age. Madara frowned, wondering why the one to whom they had a chance at peace would disappear so quickly. Most people would have stuck around to receive their accolades, and he'd always thought of Senju Tobirama as the kind of person who wanted recognition for the things he did. Granted, he was basing that opinion on little more than battlefield observances and patchy bits of shoddy spy work, but he was allowed his opinions even when they turned out to be wrong. Hashirama was halfway through a speech about finally bringing an end to the senseless violence when Madara gave in to have it and peeked under the hem of his glove, changing the course of his own future in the process. His entire body froze upon seeing the black letters stabbed across his wrist. "Mercy," they read. Hashirama's voice faded into the background as Madara stared hard at his own skin. Was mercy even an emotion? He'd never seen anything like this on anyone else's soul stamp, but then he'd also never seen anything quite like the clemency Tobirama had displayed a mere handful of minutes ago. The coincidence seemed too great for him not to consider the obvious, and yet the idea was too fantastical to possibly be true. Senju Tobirama, his soulmate. The younger brother of his best friend, his own younger brother's greatest rival, the one to whom he attributed fault for that day by the Naka River that couldn't possibly be true. There was little to do but wait and see now, since Tobirama appeared to have quit the field, and it would look extremely suspicious if the Uchiha clan had suddenly bolted for Senju grounds without first making certain that peace had indeed been established. Not knowing things had always chaffed at him, but Madara was no stranger to being denied. He made himself stay put and listened to Hashirama's now weepy speech, responded with a few blunt words of his own, and then led his people home. He could be patient when he needed to. Over the next few days, Madara kept a close eye on his wrist, watching the letters as they danced between several different emotions such as worry or irritation, though the most common seemed to be exasperation, which, if this was indeed who he thought it was, seemed completely understandable. If he had to live with Hashirama, then he would probably feel exasperated a great deal of the time too. He wondered, as he had for years now, what emotions were displayed in correlation with himself. Mostly he felt anxious, impatient, perhaps a little excited. Trying to picture those words on Tobarama's wrist only made him wonder if he had ever taken notice of the other man's hands before. When he thought about it, he couldn't even remember if Tobarama wore gloves or not. It felt as though it took forever for their clients to meet for the first peace talks in generations, and Madara wasn't sure exactly what he felt upon discovering that Tobarama wasn't present. What he wouldn't have given to see his other half's rest at that moment, just to be able to define the unholy mix of reluctant disappointment, irritation, and strangely enough relief. Paying attention for the rest of the meeting became a struggle as his hands fiddled constantly with the gloves covering them. Tobarama did not show up during the second round of peace talks either, although Madara did manage to subtly extract an explanation from Hashirama as to why. Apparently the two brothers had both agreed that it would be better for Tobarama and his quick temper to stay away until peace between their clients was on firmer feet. Madara scowled, more intrigued by that single sentence than he should have been. Only on the third time their clients came together, the official signing of the peace treaty agreed upon by both parties, did Madara finally lay eyes on Tobarama once more. Irritatingly, the other man seemed more interested in staring down Azuna with narrowed, wary eyes than looking at anyone else. Madara huffed and refused to pout despite the urge to do so. He thought he'd done a perfectly good job of hiding his own childish behavior until he heard Hashirama hum curiously, and the entire table was treated to the side of Tobarama's wrist, just barely visible with the way he'd crossed his arms, darkening with the word jealous. "I am not," Madara growled hotly. Then he froze as several pairs of eyes swiveled over to stare at him. "You not what?" Izuna asked him in a bored voice. "No one was even talking to you." He stared back at his sibling, eyes wide and brain empty. Some part of him was convinced that if he just kept his eyes on Azuna and didn't look at anyone else, then they wouldn't see him either. Or at least that's what he was hoping. He didn't count on Hashirama. "Are you jealous?" his friend cried, probably loud enough to be heard in the land of wind. "Are you Tobi's soulmate?" "Brother, do be quiet," Tobarama murmured. Madara dared to peek over and saw two things which both caught his interest. Firstly, that the other man had the slightest hint of color on the tips of his ears, the effect of which was very becoming. Secondly, that his wrist was now stabbed with embarrassment, and if that didn't cement his opinion that they had to be soulmates, he didn't know what else would. Heat burst on the back of his wrist, and unable to resist, Madara peeled back the hem of his glove to peek underneath at the new letters which had just appeared. There were many words he might have expected, plenty of others he could have understood in this situation. Instead, his head lifted and he gobbled across the table to watch Tobarama's eyes turn a single shade darker. So distracted was he that Madara didn't notice Azuna leaning over to see what had caused such a reaction from him. Intrigued. "Your soulmate feels. And it's. You two aren't actually thinking about this, are you? We haven't even signed the peace treaty yet, brother, keep it in your pants." The table around them exploded with voices all shouting over each other, but Madara had eyes only for the tiny smirk on Tobarama's lips and the hint of curiosity in the gaze locked onto his own. Chapter 122, Obito Shisui, the one where an event in their lives is written on your every day. Obito made it 3 steps in the front door of the hotel before a massive hand caught hold of his collar, and he found himself hauled into the air, feet kicking at empty space and hands scrabbling to hold on to the straps of his backpack. He was barely into his teens, but Obito wished he would just hit his growth spurt already so that no one could do this to him anymore. Not that he didn't know exactly who it was holding him up by the neck. "You," a familiar voice growled in his ear, "are going to behave yourself this weekend." "Madara-ji. How nice to see you too." Obito made an effort to twist his body and offer a friendly smile to the looming figure behind him. Instead of greeting him in return, Madara shook him like a rag doll. "I mean it. If I have to put out a single fire this weekend, I will sick Tobarama on you." Shuddering at the thought of having to deal with his uncle's crazy scientist husband, Obito hoped his nodding made him look innocent and pure. "Of course. No fires, I promise. Can I go back to the ground now?" With a great harumph, Madara dripped in. Obito stumbled and hurried away as soon as he managed to find his feet again, rushing into the venue with no idea where he was going but a great amount of confidence he would find his way somehow. The building was absolutely crawling with people he knew would be willing to help him if he asked. One of the largest clans left in Fire Country, able to trace their ancestry all the way back to the original founders of the village Obito had been born in, the Uchiha clan had since spread out to all four corners of the elemental nations. He wasn't sure whose idea it had been to have a massive reunion for them all, but he was grateful to whoever it was. Konoha was but a mere shadow of its former glory. Any excuse to get out of town for a while was a blessing, and the chance to meet members of his distant family was even more so. The only family Obito ever saw was his crotchety Uncle Madara and the frail grandmother he had lived with since he was a baby. Pushing up his sleeve to check the words on his arm for perhaps the 15th time that morning, Obito grinned and headed towards a bunch of teenagers who looked his age, most of them blessed with the distinctive Uchiha looks. Meeting new people was always a delight, but it was only half the reason he was so excited for this weekend. This morning his already high excitement had tripled upon waking up to see the event that his soulmate would experience today will meet their soulmate. As he had for the entire drive here, Obito spent his morning in a state of joy he'd heard referred to as walking on air. Every corner of every room and every new person he met felt as though they were filled with possibilities. He shook every hand he could and forgot more names than he remembered, bouncing from place to place until he found Uncle Madara tapped away in the hotel bar with his husband, both of them looking supremely uncomfortable surrounded by so many strangers. "Find em yet?" his uncle grunted. Obito shook his head. "They will. You've got dirt on your face, you know." "What?" Obito spun around to peer over at the mirror behind the bartender, mortified to see that there was indeed a giant streak of dirt down on side of his face. There was no telling how long it had been there or how many people had been too polite to say anything, though it was probably from leaning his face against the window in the car. What an excellent first impression he'd been making. Trying to scrub off the mark with the heel of his hand did nothing, so Obito hurried back out of the room to where he'd seen a sign for the public toilets. The first thing he saw when he burst into the bathroom was a tall thin boy a few years older than himself, perfect brows folded inwards to form the most aristocratic frown he'd ever seen. "You should find another bathroom," the boy said. Obito wrinkled his nose. "I just want to use the sink and the mirror," he said. From inside one of the stalls there came an ominous rattling. "Ah, let him fix his hair," a new voice called. "Someone in this joint needs to look good." "We are Uchiha," the tall boy pointed out. "We all look good. Now quit being melodramatic and can we please find somewhere more sanitary to spend our time? I am in the throes of depression, my lowest hour, and if I want to hang out in a toilet I will. Could it at least be a more private toilet?" Obito inched towards the sink, grabbing a few paper towels on the way. As he dipped them in the water and scrubbed at the dirt mark on his face, he kept one ear tilted towards the voiceover in the corner, eavesdropping shamelessly. Movies always made family drama sound so interesting, but the only drama he ever got to see was when Uncle Tobirama tried to do science in the kitchen. He watched in the mirror as the boy apparently named Itachi rubbed at the bridge of his nose and gave a snooty huff at whoever was hidden in the last stall of the row. "You are making a big deal out of something small." "And not," the other voice replied. For someone who was apparently depressed they sounded particularly upbeat, cheerful even. Obito noted that his face was completely clean now, but he kept scrubbing anyway. This conversation was the most interesting he'd heard so far today. "Please come out, Shisui. You know exactly who arrived today, and if he catches us doing what I think you're doing there will be trouble." "I don't want trouble. Mother says I can't go to math camp if I get in trouble." "Only you would be enough of a nerd to think having math camp taken away is a punishment." Itachi blinked slowly. "I enjoy math. Now put down the ladder and let's go." More curious than ever, Obito finally turned the taps off and tossed his paper towel in the bin. He decided against making any efforts to hide his actions, instead marching over to where the two others were talking and popped his head around the door before Itachi could react. Considering their conversations, he had expected to see someone in the toilet stall with a cigarette or a pilfered bottle of alcohol, perhaps even partaking in some sort of recreational drug. What he found was a boy a few years older than himself trying to get a flame from his lighter so he could set off the bottle rockets he'd strapped to the back of the tank. Shisui looked up at him with a wild grin. "Hey there. What's your name?" "Obito." "Do you like fire, Obito?" "I love fire, but Madaraji said he'd be watching me like a hawk today." "You see." Itachi huffed beside him. Even he knows not to cross Madara-sama. Can we stop this foolishness? Shisui waved him off. I said on Obito. Nonsense. What that old windbag doesn't know won't kill him. Do you want to help me light the rockets, Obito? All right. Obito dove inside the stall with stars in his eyes, beyond happy to have met someone who shared his propensity for mayhem, and reached out to take the lighter from the older boy. The moment their fingers met, a spark jumped between their skin and they both snatched their hands back. Obito looked back and forth between his fingers and Shisui. Hold shit, the other murmured. Doesn't that mean? Pull up your sleeve. What's your event for today, say? Obito held still as Shisui lunged for his arm and pulled up his sleeve, reading it out loud. We'll meet their soulmate. How come yours is so straightforward and mine isn't? What's yours say? Shisui rolled up his sleeve to show off the black writing cold down his forearm, which read, "Will fall in love." As soon as he read it, Obito promptly turned red in the face and clutched at the straps of his backpack as though they might steady him against the embarrassment. He was intrigued, sure, but anyone would be to find a soulmate as awesome as Shisui, and they barely even knew each other. It was hard to imagine how much more amazing the other boy would be once they got to know each other a little better. I thought you were going to fall in love with someone, and then maybe someday we would meet and find out we were meant to be platonic soulmates. Don't get me wrong, platonic is fine. It's fine. But that's not what you wanted. Obito ventured. Shisui snapped his fingers. Exactly. So you were going to light bottle rockets in a hotel bathroom because you thought your soulmate was going to fall in love with someone else. The other boy twisted his mouth to one side wryly. Well, anything will sound silly if you say it in that tone. Look, what I do in my utter devastation is my business. Do we really need to keep up the dramatics? Itachi asked from behind them. Instead of looking at all embarrassed by his own behavior, Shisui gave a haughty sniff and held his lighter aloft once more, clicking it a few times until he finally got a flame going. Speak for yourself, Drama King. Hey Obito, right. Do you still want to light some rockets with me? Of course. Shuffling closer, Obito all but plastered himself to Shisui's side, a massive grin splitting his face. While Itachi groaned behind them and muttered about leaving so they couldn't drag him down into their mayhem, Obito and Shisui both huddled closer to the rockets strapped to the tank of the toilet, giggling like a pair of children. As the first fuse lit and the familiar scent of burning met his nose, Obito couldn't help but send out a silent prayer of thanks to the universe for bringing him someone so perfect. Just as the other boys had predicted, he was pretty sure he was already in love. Finding his soulmate was worth every hour of the endless lecture Uncle Madara made them sit through once he caught them. Chapter 123, Tobirama Kakashi, the one where you have identical markings. Upon reaching the Pure Lands, Tobirama had easily accepted that he was dead. It was his decision, after all, to give his life so that his students might live and carry on the wall of fire in his place. He never expected to be dragged out of his eternal rest by a jutsu he himself had both made and forbade, and he certainly never expected it to happen a second time. Being reanimated was enough of a surprise, and he honestly believed that nothing else could possibly top it. He was wrong. Reanimation was one thing, but being fully resurrected and returned to life at some amorphous age in his 30s or 40s wasn't something he even thought was possible. Edo Tensei had originally been intended as a way to bring his little brothers back from the dead. All of his extensive research, even the studies he had continued in secret well into adulthood, had all come to the conclusion that such a result was impossible, yet here he stood with his heart beating inside his chest and the sclera of his eyes fading from black to white. The war raging around them left him no time to examine the precise cause of his return to the land of the living many years after he should have faded into legend. It was little surprise that Madara was as mad in death as he had been in life. Tobirama shook off the residual dust, stretched out his muscles for the sheer novelty of the enhanced sensation, and went to work. Several days after the fighting was over and the shinobi left alive had found the rest they so well deserved, Tobirama found the answers he hadn't had time to seek out before. As a former Kage himself and an infamous genius, he found himself immediately dragged into the meetings between the leaders of each village. He was only mildly surprised to discover that his opinion still carried much weight. Still, he preferred to listen to others before speaking. In his previous life he had fallen victim to pride too often, and he was far too aware of the fact that he had existed in very different times. The social and political climate of now was worlds apart from when the villages were first forming. Cooperation of the levels he witnessed during those first few days simply would not have been possible 100 years ago. It was after one of these meetings broke up and the cage each drifted away to speak in small groups or returned to their temporary quarters that Hate Kakashi, a general of Tobirama's own village, sought him out. Kakashi was a mystery to him so far. There had been few Hate in Konoha even when it was first formed, so his knowledge of that clan was limited and he hadn't been able to gather much more than he already knew. Evidently the man who led Konoha's forces was even more reticent than himself when it came to personal matters. When Kakashi asked to speak to him in private, Tobirama leapt on the chance with a very subtle enthusiasm, eager for any chance to observe such an interesting mystery. People had never been his favorite puzzles, but there was just something about this man which drew him in, something he could not explain yet hadn't bothered to resist either. They found a bit of privacy in one of the medical tents that was slowly emptying as the medics, led by an enterprising young woman named Sakura, cleared more and more shinobi to return home each day. Kakashi led him inside before returning to the door to peek his head out, ostensibly making absolutely certain that they were indeed alone. Tobirama waited patiently while the other man settled, hands seeking out his pockets in a habit so natural he didn't seem to notice himself doing it. "Thank you for speaking with me, Nadane-sama," Kakashi murmured, meeting his gaze with one eye hooded lazily and the other wide with poorly hidden interest. As Tobirama understood it, he had until recently possessed a borrowed Sharingan and was unused to having his second eye exposed, unused to having it there at all. He likely didn't even realize his unconscious emotions were visible. Of course, though there is no need to be so formal. I have not been the Nadane for many years. You carried the title with you into death, Kakashi pointed out. We continue to honor your sacrifices now in your second life. Unnecessary but appreciated. Please, it has been many years since I was known as Tobirama. I believe I would prefer to return to my simple roots. Perhaps it will keep my head from getting too big, as my brother used to say. His companion nodded, paused, and the eye he didn't seem to have mastered control of darted from side to side. Will you miss him? He asked cautiously. Tobirama admired his courage in asking. I made my peace with his death long before my own. Ah. I understand. Perhaps we might get to the subject you wish to speak with me about. The hour is late and I had planned to relieve whoever is on patrol duty. Your people are much more tired than I am. They deserve rest. Kakashi cleared his throat when I fixated confidently on Tobirama while the other shyly dropped to the side before peeking up at him again. It would have been incredibly off-putting had Tobirama not known a man in his own lifetime with a lazy eye. Ironically, the condition had been solved by intermittent use of an eye patch. Right. Yes. The subject eye, right. I guess there's really no easy way to say this, but I believe I know why you were resurrected fully rather than temporarily reanimated like the others. Truly. Leaning in curiously, Tobirama distantly hoped his interested expression didn't carry the same evil scientist vibe that it used to, although judging by Kakashi's raised eyebrows, his hopes were in vain. Go on then. I haven't come up with a single viable theory myself. Instead of answering, Kakashi nodded to himself and reached up to the mask he never seemed to go without. His fingers played with the ham as he took a deep steadying breath, and then he peeled it down in one fell swoop, and Tobirama felt the world around them go still. Of all the things he might have guessed that mask to be hiding, this was not one of them. He knew those markings, the 3 red lines decorating the pale face beforehand. They were the same marks he had been born with on his own face. Many people in his lifetime had mistaken them for tattoos, and he had not once bothered to correct them, though he had often wondered if his denial of them had been part of what prevented him from ever finding his soulmate. Now he knew it was not his own fault but the fault of time. His soulmate had not been born until nearly a century after he was already dead. Without thinking, he raised his hands to cup the other man's face, tracing the familiar lines with his thumbs. At the first touch he knew them to be genuine. Kakashi's skin was nearly the same color as his own, where it wasn't stained pink with faint embarrassment, and it was Tobirama's humble opinion that the 3 markings they shared looked better on the other man than they ever had on him. You believe our connection is what brought me back to life, he murmured. Kakashi hummed in agreement. I do. I also thought I should tell you about this as soon as the situation was calm enough for us to speak about personal matters. This seemed like something that was too big to keep a secret no matter how you felt about it. HN. You expected a rejection, didn't you? The way Kakashi shrugged carelessly, a well-practiced motion, told him that this was a man who had seen his fair share of rejections and losses, who was used to being hurt and soldiering on despite the pain. It was an attitude he sympathized with. I wonder, he ventured slowly, retracting his hands at last, if he might take your evening meal with me tonight. Perhaps I can put off sentry duty for a short while. He knew it was the right thing to say when both of Kakashi's eyes focused on him with a spark of something pleasant and curious burning in the depths. More than that, he knew that Kakashi understood the offer he had just made, and it was a delight to realize, as so many others had before him, that his soulmate truly was a good match for him. If this was what he had been reborn to find, then Tobirama was happy to follow Kakashi to wherever this second chance at life might take them. Chapter 124, Kakashi, Tobirama, Obito, the one where proximity heals you. How many more people are we going to have to meet? Obito whined, tugging on Kakashi's sleeve and dreading his footsteps in protest. Kakashi smiled at him. This behavior was nothing new, neither of them could be called social butterflies, although most people figured him to be the worst of the pair. Most people were wrong. Just a few. I don't know how many people Rin invited. Why does she need so many friends? She should just talk to the same 5 people every day like we do, that's much easier. You mean it would be easier for you to deal with? Kakashi grinned and Obito tilted his head, acquiescing the point. Weaving their fingers together, Kakashi dragged his boyfriend down the hall where they could at least get a few moments of privacy to recharge. Knowing their usual hermit-like habits, it wouldn't be too long before they both started looking for escape routes. Rin always seemed to know when they were thinking of escaping, though, and that was usually when she found some reason to make them the center of attention as a punishment for trying to bail. As soon as they were alone in their friend's bedroom, Obito collapsed against him and groaned loudly into his hair, making Kakashi smile again. The two of them had been together for so long it almost felt as though they'd never been apart, and many assumed they must be soulmates. Unfortunately, they were not. Both of them had questioned it many times over the years, how two people could be so obviously meant for each other yet not be soulmates. Their relationship felt so right, but there was always a feeling in the back of both their minds that something was missing, something more that was meant to be there. Despite that, they had absolutely no plans to leave each other. They had made promises to each other years ago that even the arrival of one of their soulmates would not split them apart. Kakashi gently patted Obito's back, drumming his fingers along the other man's spine while they both enjoyed the quiet without dozens of other people crowding them from every direction. If it weren't for how much they loved Rin, they would never have come here today. But they did love her, and so they were forced to suffer through the one day a year she could guilt them into being properly social. Come on, Kakashi mumbled with a kiss to his boyfriend's temple. We should get going. Don't wanna. When Obito straightened, he was frowning in a way that pulled at the scars twisting the right side of his face. Kakashi kissed his twisted cheek and nuzzled his own scar against it. Maybe later we can slip back in here for a while without Rin catching us. She always knows, Obito whined. Still, he pulled away and heaved a sigh as he reached for the door. The party was just as loud and crowded as it had been when they left. Guy waved at them enthusiastically from across the room, but they pretended not to see and skirting around Kasame's massive bulk to hide behind him instead. Even something as simple as waving back ran the risk of getting them swept up in some ridiculous challenge. It was safer to hide and pray that he wouldn't find them until later on in the evening when they could claim fatigue. Rin found them huddled together next to the snack table in the living room about an hour later, grinning brightly to see them, at least making the effort not to look as bored as she knew they felt. She was dragging a tall man behind her with pale skin and perpendicular scars on both of his cheeks. His eyes glowed red in the semi-lit room, but it appeared to be his natural color, interestingly enough. Boys, I'd like to introduce you to Tobirama. I figured you might at least have something to talk about with a fellow introvert. Rin gave her companion a pointed smirk, to which he rolled his eyes. Tobirama, these are my friends Kakashi and Obito. Boys, this is my co-worker Tobirama. My condolences on having to work with her, Kakashi jerked, holding out the hand that was not still wrapped around Obito's fingers. Tobirama snorted and reached out to shake his hand politely. The moment their skin touched, a shudder ran through him, the skin on his face positively crawling. Kakashi was already shaking his head violently as though to dislodge the feeling when he heard Obito cry out, and concern for his boyfriend immediately overrode his reaction, any strange sensations he was experiencing. When he looked to his side, however, his worries about his own face were thrown completely out the window as he took in what was happening to Obito's. It looked almost like ripples underneath his skin, the entire right half of his face shifting like paper rippling in a heavy wind. Kakashi had never seen anything more bizarre in his life, and, in truth, just looking at it made him feel a little sick. Obito's panic under the shifting of his face was clear enough that all three of them gathered closer to hide him from sight of the rest of the room, protecting him until they could figure out what was happening or if they needed help. It only took a little over a minute for it to stop, but when it did, what was left behind was perhaps even freakier than the process itself. Where before his face had been riddled with scars, there was now smooth, unbroken skin. All marks of the accident he suffered in his childhood had been completely erased, even the small scar on the bottom of his chin from when he had tripped and bashed his face on the floor in high school. "Holy shit," Kakashi muttered under his breath. Obito looked back at him with wide, frightened eyes. What happened? What's wrong with my face? Your scars are gone." "They what?" Jerking his free hand up to gingerly feel around the area, Obito looked about, ready to faint up tea. "Holy shit. Oh my god. They are gone. So is yours. What the fuck is happening?" Kakashi only realized he was still holding on to Rin's friend Tobirama when he tried to raise a hand to check his own face. Both of them flickered their eyes towards each other's faces in shock, then paused to stare, separating their hands only to point at each other. "Your scars are gone. And yours, as your partner said." Tobirama looked like the shock had left him numb, but he still brought his opposite hand up to brush over the place where his scars used to be. "What on earth is Vo? Oh my. Oh, you what? We've healed each other's wounds, all three of us. When you shook my hand, you connected the three of us and we were healed." His words left all four of them silent, a pocket of complete stillness, while the party raged on around them without a single clue as to what was happening in its midst. Rin stumbled when someone bumped into her from behind and scowled, looking around at all the people ruining this perfect moment of discovery. Her face rearranged itself into a look of determination as she grabbed both Tobirama and Obito and murmured for everyone to follow her. She led them through the maze of people stuffing the living room and passed by the kitchen, ignoring Anko's voice trying to lure them into taking a few shots. Kakashi smiled a little when he was stuffed back into her bedroom for the second time that evening, and enjoyed the irony that for once it was their socialite friend who was trying to find them a bit of privacy. "As much as I would love to stay and gobble at you all, this probably isn't any of my business, so I'll leave you three alone to talk. But I expect details later." Narrowing her eyes at her two best friends until they nodded, Rin slipped out the door to go mingle with the rest of her guests. In her absence, the three men stood staring at each other without much clue about what to say. Unsurprisingly, Obito opened his big mouth first. "Well, this was unexpected," he said. "Your grasp of the obvious continues to dazzle me," Kakashi shot back blandly. Then he blinked in surprise when Tobirama snorted in amusement. "Unexpected is a good word for the situation. The most I expected out of this night was to offer the birthday girl a few well wishes and then spend the rest of my time wishing to go home. Finding my soulmates is a very welcome surprise." His head cocked to one side with a contemplative expression. "You two are already in a relationship, correct? Were you aware that your bond was intended to have a third link?" "No, we thought we weren't soulmates at all." Obito looked over at his partner with a knowing smile before giving Tobirama a very deliberate once-over, dragging his eyes up the length of the man's body in an assessing manner. "It might not have occurred to us as an option before, but, I have to admit, I'm kind of into the idea." "The cashier? Do you have to make everything sound so dirty?" Kakashi asked while Tobirama flushed slightly. "Well, I meant it in a dirty way." "Of course he did. You do have the spirit of it though. What do you say, Tobirama? Care to climb down the fire escape with us and go out for coffee?" "That sounds delightful, actually." Climbing down the fire escape became climbing up instead to sit on the roof and talk for hours about everything and nothing at all. Having coffee together became going home together, piling themselves into Tobirama's bed in a messy pile of linen so hopelessly tangled they were probably going to have trouble separating themselves come morning. And 2 became 3 from that night on, the missing piece of the puzzle finally slipping into place. Chapter 125, Madara, Tobirama, the one where you see color only where they touch. Hey Hashirama, who packed your lunch this morning? Madara eyed the apple sitting next to his best friend's lunch bag, contemplating the brilliant red of it. I think it was Idama. No wait, he brought it to me because I forgot it at home, but I don't know whether he made it or not. Why? No reason. Disappointed, he turned away with a scowl and took a large bite out of the plain grey sandwich in his hands. He had determined the first day of school, the very first day he met his fellow teachers at Konoha Academy of Magic, that his soulmate must be one of the Senju brothers. The difficulty was in determining which one. All 4 of them lived together in the house they had grown up in, all 4 of them taught different subjects in the same school, and all 4 of them came to work every day in clothes that showed up in color to Madara's eyes. He tried everything he could think of to try and figure it out without letting the 4 men catch on to what he was doing. Luckily Hashirama was as oblivious as they came, as Madara could ask whatever strange questions he wanted without raising any suspicious. Even slightly odd things like who in the house did the laundry they all took turns, or whether he dressed himself that day. Thankfully yes garnered no more reaction from Hashirama than a quick answer and his typical friendly smile. It was, in a word, annoying. Madara detested not knowing things. After lunch the 2 of them walked together back to the floor both of their classrooms were on. Madara had gone through the classrooms of all 4 Senju brothers with a fine-toothed comb, disgusted to find that every item in every room showed up in full color. Their habit of sharing everything they owned was as sweet as it was irritating. They stopped by Hashirama's classroom first, where he taught herbology and sometimes potion-making depending on the year of the class he was teaching. Madara looked at the colorful whiteboard and the decorations on the walls with their many hues and sighed, retreating before he could let himself grow depressed over the indecision again. He wouldn't exactly fight against it if his soulmate turned out to be Hashirama, although he doubted that their bond would ever grow beyond a platonic one, but he couldn't deny that he hoped that wasn't the case. He knew exactly which brother he was hoping turned out to be his soulmate, but at the same time he was almost certain he was wrong. Of the 4 of them Tobirama was the most intelligent, even more intelligent than Madara himself, as hard as that was to admit. It seemed impossible for them to have known each other this long without the younger man figuring it out. He had made an effort to at least get to know the other 2 on the chance that it turned out to be one of them, but he had yet to feel any sort of draw to anyone other than Tobirama. Speaking of, Madara very nearly lost control of his inner magic in a bad way when he turned into his own specially fireproofed classroom of pyrotechnics, only to find the very man he'd just been thinking of sitting at his desk. Need something, Senju, he ground out, marching over to swat the man's feet off the top of his desk. The permission slips from your 3rd-year class for the elemental fair next week. Ah. Right. Madara grimaced. He'd almost managed to forget about the dreaded yearly field trip. Ah, yes, I'll get them now. Would you move? With a grouchy frown he shoved Tobirama away from his desk, sending the chair rolling across the floor and forcing the other man to catch himself before he could collide with a cabinet full of the mild fire bombs Madara used to create flames for his students to manipulate. Doing it himself for so many kids a day was just too tiring. With his desk accessible now he was able to root around through the drawers, trying to figure out where he put the slips he'd collected several days before. As he rummaged through the mess of sparking compounds and half-marked homework assignments, he idly wondered when exactly his own desk had turned brown. Had it been a day when more than one of the Senju brothers came into his classroom for something? Had he even been in the room himself at the time? There weren't many things in his desk that didn't show up to him in color, his own space just as much a victim of the Senju habit for sharing things. Mostly what still showed up in black and white were the papers which, he had learned a while back, were actually supposed to look that way. He was fairly disappointed the day he found out that even in the world of color he would still have to see some things in black and white. Really, Uchiha, organize your desk a little better and you won't have this problem. Not all of us can shift matter through multiple dimensions just to keep our possessions tidy. Madara snapped. A triumphant noise escaped him where he finally uncovered the dark grey packet he'd been looking for, bound together with little more than a loose paperclip. Here, you impatient idiot. Tobirama looked down at them with a bemused expression. "Those are your permission slips?" he asked. Madara snorted and held them out more insistently. "Obviously. Why aren't you taking them?" "My apologies, I just didn't expect." "Well. I suppose I couldn't wait forever." "What are you talking about?" Giving a quick shrug, Tobirama reached out to take the packet. As soon as his fingers brushed them, Madara was flabbergasted to watch the dark gray papers blossom into a light shade of red which someone had clearly left in the teacher's lounge without realizing they were colored. But if he could see the color now, then that could only mean one thing. His head snapped up to stare at his fellow teacher with wide eyes and a thundering heart. We? Soulmates. Imagine that, Tobirama said in a mild tone. You knew. Well, of course I knew. I knew the day that we met when I could see your clothing and everything you touched lit up one by one. Madara spluttered through a few incoherent half-starts before finally managing to spit out, "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you didn't seem to notice and I wanted to see how long it would take you to figure it out. And then you kept not figuring it out and I figured I'd already committed to waiting. It gave us the chance to get to know each other first, at the very least, which is more than many soulmates get. I knew it was one of you." Madara crossed his arms and tapped his head down, hoping his massive hair hid the shamed blush on his face. "But you all share everything, you and your brothers. It was impossible to tell. Why didn't you just try handing us things, something none of us had touched yet?" Mouth already wide open to another retort, Madara snapped it shut to blink owlishly. "I never thought of that." "How could I have never thought of that?" "You're lucky you're cute," Tobirama informed him dryly. Madara blinked even more rapidly. With a resigned roll of his pretty red eyes, Tobirama dropped the packet of forms on the desk and reached out to drag Madara forward, meeting him in the middle for a somewhat clumsy kiss that still managed to curl his toes. Madara whined low in his throat, feeling the heat rise inside him and not bothering to pay attention to the sparks going off behind his eyelids. He realized his mistake too late when reality rather abruptly informed him that those sparks were not the fabled fireworks that were rumored to show up during a first kiss. They were actual sparks, small bits of his uninhibited magic leaping about, agitated by his emotional state, and without any restraints they had leapt straight off his body and onto the cabinet of fire bonds. His only warning was a split second to recognize the smell of something burning before he pulled away from Tobirama with a gasp. Explosion was all he could choke out. In the very next moment he was standing 3 floors down and bracing himself as the building rocked under the concussive blast of the 4th classroom to explode that semester. Never had he been more thankful for Tobirama's teleportation magic. "My brother is going to be upset with you for that," Tobirama murmured, not quite letting go of him just yet despite the students milling about the hallways around them. "Which one?" "Why? I didn't mean to. Blowing things up is kind of Idama's thing. He's going to be most upset with you for stealing his thunder." But this is your fault too." "Ah. I suppose you're correct. Then I should at least do something to earn my punishment, shouldn't I?" Tobirama sent him a wicked grin that weakened his knees and then pulled him in for another kiss which filled the hallway with untamed sparks, sending the gobbling students screaming in all directions. Only after he'd had his breath stolen and his mind blown did it occur to Madara that he was going to have to acquire new permission slips now, since the ones he'd already gone to the trouble of getting signed had just gone up in smoke. Chapter 126, Tobirama Manada, the one where you have uncontrollable telepathy until you meet. Having lived and lost his life already, Minato hardly expected to find himself dumped a century into the past after he was released from the Edo Tensei Jutsu. And yet, because his life was just kind of like that, time travel wasn't even the most surprising thing he encountered when he woke to find the landscape around him so different. The most surprising thing was actually the very startled voice inside his head demanding to know who he was. Minato honestly wasn't sure what to say. In his first life he'd never had a soulmate, no voice which ever spoke in his mind as so many others had described for him. His lack of any destined bonds was part of what drew Kushina to him, her soulmate having died when they were both very young, and at the time he had thanked his lucky stars that the universe had been smart enough to leave him free for her. Now he questioned the wisdom of fate as the angry voice of some unknown male cut in and out at random to ask the same questions over and over like they could wring the answers from him through sheer annoyance. Whoever they were, they sounded like the sort of person who was used to getting their way in things. Minato didn't particularly feel like answering most of the questions he was put to. Each time he tried to ask a question of his own, he was summarily rebuffed, so he didn't see why he should be so free with his own information. After a couple of weeks, the angry demands faded into grumbling comments occasionally throughout the day, and that was much easier to live with. As he explored the land he had known so well in his own time, noting each change and everything that seemed to be the same, Minato was most content on the days the voice in his mind asked the new questions the other had turned to, more curious now about his opinion on certain subjects than getting answers for things Minato couldn't begin to explain. Weeks turned into months, spring turned to summer, observing his homeland became a journey to explore the 5 nations as a whole, and the annoying nuisance in his head somehow became a friend along the way. Of course, he was a bitter friend with jagged edges and a clear lack of self-preservation. Minato learned through their broken conversations that the other man had a deep love for science and jutsu experimentation. He was horrified to learn how often those experiments ended in injury, freely giving his own thoughts and ideas whenever he thought it might help avoid such things. He was all the way at the other end of Earth country when he learned the one piece of information which brought everything together inside his mind, revealing the other man's identity without ever learning his name. It's called the Hiraishin, the voice had told him. Or it will be when it's perfected. I haven't figured out the right formula for the seal yet. Making his way through a quiet civilian village which had been much larger when he was first alive, Minato turned around and headed back in the opposite direction as soon as those words were spoken to him. Suddenly it was imperative he returned to Fire Country. His mental companion had time to ask petulantly why he was being so quiet before their intermittent connection broke, and Minato was left alone in his own head to stumble his way back to what might someday become his home again. Several days later he arrived in Fire Country, cursing his leap through time for rendering all the seals he had laid for travel over the year as useless. His first instinct was to head for Konoha, until he remembered that Konoha did not exist yet and there would be nothing there but a patch of untamed forest. Although he had studied many things in his time, it never would have occurred to him to even be curious where the Senju ancestral lands were, and without a clear direction Minato was left with few options. He opted for the easiest route. Tobirama, he called out through the link he could sense to the other man. I think it's time we meet, don't you? How do you know my name? Came the suspicious demand. Minato smiled wryly. It would be easier to explain that in person, though it will take some time. He gave his soulmate a few minutes to silently mull that over, wondering slowly over the spot which would one day hold the seat of power for the very first shinobi village. He was smiling wistfully with a head full of memories which had not yet come to pass when he got his answer. Convince me you are being sincere. That, Minato thought with a smirk, was easy. I know how to make the Hiraishin work. I'll tell you if you agree to meet with me. You're bluffing. Not at all. The formula you were using had almost no flaws, but there was one small oversight. A day later, and he stood on the shore of the Naka River a mere 10 feet away from the man he had worshipped in his childhood despite never having met him. Senju Tobirama looked back at him warily but with a spark of interest plain in his eyes which Minato thought was much more attractive than it had any right to be. He was getting a bit ahead of himself, thinking about how attractive his soulmate was when the other hadn't given him any indication yet as to whether he would accept their bond or not, let alone whether they might have the potential for something romantic. Your name? Tobirama called, every muscle in his body coiled and ready for action in the way of a man whose entire life had been lived under the never-ending heat of war. My name is Namikaze Minato. I tried the formula you spoke of. His soulmate rolled a kunai through its pale fingers as he spoke, fresh ink shining on the paper wrapped about its handle. It worked. There are a lot of things I'll need to explain before you offer me any thanks. Minato tilted his weight back onto his heels nervously. Then he tilted his head curiously at the shadow of a smirk which had appeared on the other man's lips. Who said I was going to thank you? I was going to pick your brain for more ideas. Minato tilted his head back and laughed, long and loud, until he felt free of a past which was also a future. For the first time since he woke up again he felt completely here, in this moment, in this time, and it wasn't anywhere near as frightening as he might have expected it to be. Explaining things did indeed take as long as he had warned that they would, although part of that was due to the way Tobirama kept interrupting him with questions which led them both off on theoretical tangents and jutsu speculation. Minado's second favorite part of the day was the moment he was asked to demonstrate the improvements he'd made upon the Hiraishin in his own time, and Tobirama admitted to being impressed. He'd come very close to swooning with the remnants of hero worship crawling up through his memories. His very favorite part of the day, however, was Tobirama's smile, full of hesitant welcome as he cautiously invited Minado back to the Senju compound where they might speak further and get to know each other a little better. It was a thrill racing down his spine to realize that perhaps the past could also hold a future for them both. Chapter 127, Kakashi Sakura, the one where you hear mental static until you meet. I want to tell you to turn off the television, Sakura mumbled at the open air between her and the ceiling, but I know it isn't on. What you want are a nice pair of mental earplugs, Ino said. Even without looking, Sakura could practically feel her best friend smirking, as though the quirk of those perfectly painted lips had made ripples in the air which set off her instinct to cringe. Shut up, pig. Amazingly, Ino did shut up. Most people had the decency not to mock anyone who hadn't found their soulmate yet and still suffered from the constant mental static of separation. Ino was not most people, although that was admittedly one of the reasons Sakura had first been drawn into their strange and sometimes violent friendship. There were few other people she would trust half as much as her best friend, and no one else who she would dropkick faster. On a better day, Sakura was able to stand the good-natured bickering between her and her roommate and even enjoy it, but there were days like today when the noise in her head made her think deeply about the asylums lurking at edge of every town in the 5 nations. Like most people, those places represented her worst fear, that she might never find her other half and be driven to madness by the constant mental static she would never be able to escape. The very thought of it was enough to run shivers down her spine and roll her off the edge of the mattress, rising to her feet to pace in helpless agitation. Muted thumps and raised voices on the other side of her bedroom wall drew a scowl. "What the hell is all the ruckus out there?" she snapped. Ino looked up from where she was sitting in the window and painting her nails. "New neighbors are moving into the apartment across the hall, remember? Why don't you go yell at them to keep it quiet? Blow off some steam or something. They'll think I'm a bitch." "You don't have to get along with everyone in the world," Ino pointed out, waving one hand through the air to dry the paint. Sakura gave her a very long look before sighing and turning for the bedroom door. Yelling wouldn't accomplish much, but maybe she could ask them to keep it down a bit. She was well acquainted with the stress and frustration of moving into a new apartment, but there was no need for anyone to shout as much as whoever that was out in the common hallway. As soon as she opened her front door, Sakura regretted it. Her first impression was that the man before her could probably fit her entire head in the palm of his hand. Her second impression was that his voice was as big as his body. Turns out he wasn't really yelling, just speaking with enough enthusiasm to psych up 3 Little League baseball teams. Sakura flinched when he whipped around at the sound of her door opening and greeted her with a smile that nearly damaged her eyesight with its brightness. "Greetings, new neighbor of my most beloved rival." "Ah, yeah." Irritable already, it was clear she would not have the patience to deal with this man. "Listen, you're being really loud and my static is giving me a terrible headache. Could you, shut the fuck up? My sincerest apologies. I had no idea I was being so loud." He even looked sorry. She might have felt bad for putting such earnest tears in his eyes if he had bothered to lower his volume at all while apologizing, which he had not. Before she had time to let her bad temper loose, however, another voice did so first. "Guy, shut up. I've asked you 34 times, this makes 35 to shut up today. I said I needed your help moving, not that I needed a damn cheer section whipping my furniture around." The newcomer spoke from behind the massive box he was carrying, visible only as a tuft of silver hair. "But rival? No. Shush. Quiet. Zip it. Quiet as Daunicus. Oh. Since when does my esteemed rival speak Latin? I'm impressed. And I'm in pain," Sakura snarled. "So button up, big boy, or I'll give you a headache too." The human mountain in front of her teared up again and gave her a guilty look somewhat reminiscent of the one she used to use to beg cookies from her parents. It did nothing to earn her sympathies. Sakura winced as the mental static inside her mind kicked it up a notch, almost as though it was angry at her for trying to ignore it. From behind the massive box floating beside her there came a muted noise of disgust, and then her new neighbor set his load down on the floor and she got her first good look at him while he rubbed his temples. He was nowhere near as old as the color of his hair suggested, probably a few years older but still young, and he had an unseasonable scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face despite the last clinging heat of summer. Sakura was in the middle of thanking the universe for at least having the mercy to send her a bit of eye candy when he looked up and their gazes met. Silence. Instant, blissful silence. Embarrassingly, Sakura's first instinct was to panic because her body recognized that something was gone which had always been there. After a few gasping breaths, she finally realized what was happening and what exactly it meant. Her jaw fell even lower and her awareness of anything except the man in front of her faded away. He stared back, equally as entranced by her as she was by him. "Well, this is unexpected." To say the least, she breathed in reply. "Suddenly I'm really glad I took the job offer here instead of the one across town." "Why, yeah. Me too." Head whipping back and forth between them, the noisy mountain man was scratching his head. "Do you know your neighbors already? How youthful. You must have come and met her earlier." "No, Guy. She's I found my soulmate." "Wow. We need to sit." "Sitting is good." His eyes grew impossibly larger as his knees trembled and Sakura laughed even as she felt the same weakness in her own shaking limbs. "We can sit in my apartment," she offered. "Your soulmate." Guide, if she'd heard his name right, he wasn't a top priority at the moment, screeched loud enough to rattle the ceiling tiles. "That would be nice. My name is Kakashi." "Sakura." When he popped his face up above the edge of his scarf, he was wearing the cutest lopsided smile she had ever seen in her life. "Hi." "Yeah. Guy, you wouldn't mind bringing the rest up yourself, would you?" "It's just..." "Of course. Say no more, rival. Let the flower of your love blossom." Guy all but lunged for the boxers still on the floor by their feet and hurled himself through the open door across the hall. Neither of them spared so much as a glance for him, still much too caught up in each other to even think about dealing with anything else at the moment. This is me right here." Sakura waved vaguely at her own door and Kakashi followed her in, both of them trying not to take their eyes off each other as they awkwardly made their way inside. "Quiet," he murmured. Complete silence. "My roommates described it for me a dozen times, but I still..." "Yeah. You're really pretty." Kakashi's face turned red and he looked away for the first time, clearly embarrassed to have let that slip out. Rather than laugh at him, Sakura joined him in blushing, hiding her pleased smile by turning to lead him over to the couch. She wondered what it would take to convince Ina to go out for a while and leave them be. As much as she was dying to get to know the soulmate she'd started to believe she might never meet, what she wanted more than anything was to simply sit here and enjoy the silence together. From the way Kakashi closed his eyes and reached for her hand, head tilting back with a peaceful smile, she would guess that he felt the same. Chapter 128, Madara, Tobirama, the one where scars on them show up on you. Madara woke up with a new scar on his arm. It was there when he opened his eyes, a thin brown streak where there had been only pale unbroken skin when he went to sleep the night before. As he rolled over in bed and stared at the ceiling, yawning so wide his jaw very nearly dislocated, Madara scoured through his memories out of habit. Had he seen anyone he knew with injuries on their arm recently? Not that he could recall. It wasn't exactly a massive source of irritation that he couldn't think of anyone. Like everyone else, Madara had been living with the random appearance of new scars on his body since he was very young, and if he hadn't figured it out in the last 27 years, then his odds of doing so now were really only slightly better. Making peace and building a village had certainly given him the opportunity to meet more people, but it had done nothing to change his preference for quiet and solitude. Even if he randomly decided to emulate Hashirama's habit of making friends with every child, rock, and squirrel, he was still aware that his soulmate might not even live in this part of the world. His morning was no more disturbed by this scar than any of the others he already carried. When he made his way into the tower that day, Madara's thoughts were centered more on the claims for budget abuse he was supposed to be investigating than the fact that his arm had acquired a new blemish. He briefly noted the presence of Tobirama in their shared office and nodded once in lieu of welcoming him back from his mission to the IWA border. Tobirama nodded back and went back to his scrolls without a word. Though he would rather chew off his own fingers than say so, his usual morning exchange with Tobirama was one of the daily rituals he enjoyed the most. Not because he and Tobirama were particularly close, but because it was just the sort of communication he wished the rest of the world could practice, wordless, silent, and free of the unnecessary aggression which had marked every conversation between the two of them for the first half a year after their clients came together. They might not be friends exactly, but Madara often felt a certain kinship with Tobirama now, which made it much easier to work in the same room with him. It was a kinship partially based on a shared exasperation with Hashirama, but the source hardly mattered. Madara had only just settled into his desk and sighed at the pile of work waiting for him when the door swung open again to admit his best friend. Hashirama also shared their office, though he flitted in and out so often they had been contemplating evicting him to his own space to save themselves the constant distraction. Rather than head towards his own desk, Hashirama went straight for his little brother, smile on his face and arms open wide, cooing like one would at a small child. "So you did come home last night? I thought I heard someone in the kitchen this morning. And you didn't get up to investigate? Brother, honestly. Just because we're not at war anymore does not mean you should allow your awareness as a shinobi to grow dull. Losing your instincts could get you killed. Wow. I missed you too." Hashirama stuck out his tongue, then used his massive arms to drag his sibling into a hug and pinion there. Madara snickered openly at the dismay on Tobirama's face and then promptly buried his own in some papers when the noise drew a sharp glare over in his direction. He did continue to snicker though, peering over the top of the folder he'd grabbed and watching gleefully as Hashirama began the same ritual he insisted upon every time his younger brother went on a mission out of the village, hands reaching everywhere they could reach in search of anomalies. "Are you hurt? Did you get injured? Any broken things or blood or eviscerations? No death? Clearly I died," Tobirama drawled. "This is my ghost you're fondling. Don't be like that. I just want to know if you've been hurt anywhere so I can heal it." "I'm fine, it's already healed." He quite obviously regretted those words a moment later when Hashirama gasped and pawed at his shirt as though he'd said he was bleeding out right there in his chair. "You were injured?" "Where?" "It was just my sir, calm down." Amused as he was by the scene in front of him, Madara didn't even make any connection between the other man's words and the new scar he had woken up with until Hashirama pushed an exasperated Tobirama's sleeve up to reveal the thin brown line sitting low on his right bicep. Madara froze as soon as his eyes landed on that mark. His hand rose to touch his own arm while he watched the siblings bickering across from him, staring long after Tobirama's sleeve had fallen back into place and bickering had turned into a spiteful shoving match. "Get away. I'm working. You so cute, Toby, did you know that? I am nothing of the sort. Now shoo, or I'll ask Madara for a rundown of all the paperwork he didn't get done while I was gone and make he do it now." "Hey." Pouting indignantly, Hashirama scuttled off to his own desk and flopped down in his chair, pulling the contents of his overflowing inbox closer until it at least appeared that he intended to be productive. It wasn't that Hashirama had no work ethic or that he was a poor Hokage, quite the opposite. Really, it was just that he spent perhaps too much time on public relations and not enough time on the more boring details like sanitation bylaws. His strengths lay in leading but not in administration. Finally free of unwanted coddling, Tobirama looked up at Madara with a smirk hanging about his lips, clearly expecting to share the jerk with him as they always did when one of them managed to put Hashirama back to work. His expression became confused when he saw the way Madara was staring at him so openly. "Are you all right?" he asked. Madara wheezed incoherently. "Okay. If that's all you needed." Tobirama shook his head and returned his eyes to the papers on the desk in front of him. Madara wheezed again. "I don't think he's okay," Hashirama said, standing up to crane around his piles of paperwork. "HM? What? No, I'm fine." Madara shook his head in an effort to draw himself back to reality. It was only partially successful in that it managed to break his vapid stare, but it was not enough to chase away the memory of that thin line on Tobirama's arm, leaving him in a state he knew would not be conducive to paperwork. "If you gentlemen would excuse me, perhaps I will find somewhere else to work today." Rather than wait to fend off the inevitable objections, he snatched up a thick stack of whatever projects happened to be closest and darted out the door even as both of the Senju brother opened their mouths to say something. Madara darted into the first empty room he could find and walked over to gaze blankly out the window. Thinking himself in the clear, he allowed his body to slump against the glass pane, staring down at the people below while he waited for his heart to quit leaping around in his chest like a drunken monkey. What had started off as a calm morning much like any other had suddenly become a day he knew he would come back to in his memories over, and all he wanted was a few moments to process that. He expected to be left alone for as long as he needed, so it was a bit of a surprise when the door opened and he felt Tobirama's calm still water-flowing chakra wash over him like a soothing balm. "You looked as though you were about to faint," the other murmured. "I won't be as intrusive about it if you require medical attention." "I don't. As I said, I'm fine." "Really?" One side of Tobirama's mouth quirked up as he stepped closer, arms folded in a manner which said he didn't believe a word of Madara's weak protests. Before he could stop himself, Madara dropped his eyes to the other man's arm and blurted, "Can I see your scar again?" He only just managed not to cringe at how awkward and desperate he sounded to his own ears. "My scar?" Tobirama's hand was moving upwards automatically even while his face twisted with confusion. "Please," Madara said. "I just need to confirm something." After giving him a look for being so cryptic, Tobirama took hold of his short sleeve and pushed the material up to expose the top of his arm. From up close it was even more obvious how identical the mark was to the one Madara had seen upon first waking this morning. The shape of it curved almost lovingly around his muscle like a frame, drawing the eye to just the right point for prime muscle admiration. Were Madara so inclined, he could use the scar as a guide for where to stare and drool over the other man's perfectly shaped arms. Right then he was more inclined to raise his eyes to Tobirama's and lick his lips nervously. "I have that scar too," he murmured. "Oh?" From the polite yet distant tone of that single word it was clear that Tobirama did not see his meaning. Madara huffed as he reached for his own sleeve, dragging the heavy material upwards until that same spot was visible. He studiously ignored the fleeting hope that the other wouldn't notice how his arms weren't quite as defined anymore after delegating most of his missions to others now that they had the manpower to do so. He should really train more often. "I didn't have this yesterday, but it was there when I woke up this morning." "Oh." Tobirama's tone was appropriately stunned this time, to Madara's satisfaction. "Yes." "So? HM." The only problem was that he had no idea where to go from here. Was he supposed to beat around the bush until he figured out what kind of bond the other man was interested in? Shouldn't he figure out first what kind of bond he himself was interested in? They got along surprisingly well these days, so he couldn't say he was disappointed, at least. "Dinner?" "HM." Madara drew his brows together in confusion. "Will you have dinner with me this evening?" "We can discuss this in a more private setting." Tobirama peered at him from underneath snowy lashes, and Madara wondered dazedly if he'd ever noticed before how long they were, how prettily they brushed against pale cheeks. "Yes, that sounds, yes." "Thank you." Tobirama smiled, lingering for a few moments before turning and going back to their office. No doubt Hashirama was waiting for him with 100 questions and more about what was going on, and Madara did not envy him having to deal with that. With a deep breath he turned back to the window to look out at the sprawling village below, unaware of the smile he too was wearing unconsciously. What a beautiful day it was. Chapter 129, Shino, Karen, the one where when you cry they cry. "You know that you're crying, right?" "I am aware, yes." "Thank you for your concern, Naruto." "But, like, you know that they're sympathies, right?" "Yes, I also knew that." Shino adjusted his sunglasses to the edge of his nose, making a bit of room so that the pearly white tears streaming from his eyes might run unimpeded. He himself wasn't particularly sad at the moment, but his soulmate appeared to be crying, and so he had little choice in the matter. Interrupting the sympathies felt as though he were dismissing some unknown other person's pain, and so Shino allowed them to run freely down his face, dripping from his chin, and continued on down the hallway without so much as a change of expression. Most kids his age would probably be worried about appearing weak to their fellow high schoolers. Shino himself had never cared much what other people thought of him. He was already odd with his fondness for bugs and his eyes that stared too hard at everything he looked at, even hidden behind the glasses as they usually were. One more bit of oddness hardly bothered him. He did prefer to be somewhere quieter, however, and since this was his free period he had the freedom to go wherever he wanted to. Ducking away from his friend and into the stairwell, Shino bypassed the stairs for the door just at the other side of them, which took him outside to the school's bedraggled, thirsty-looking garden. He'd spent many an hour here watching ants crawl by in their perfect lines and aphids chew at the dying plants. Yesterday he had spotted a new beehive forming on the branches of the only tree in the garden, and his plan was to check up on it to make sure no one had thoughtlessly knocked it down in the meantime. Those plans were foiled by the figure huddled between the tree's roots, sniffling and thumping at the bark with one cold first. Shino tilted his head, hesitant, unsure of what to say or if he should say anything at all. "This is not a good place to make such sudden movements," he said eventually. The girl startled and looked up at him with the most beautiful red eyes he'd ever seen, leaving him off-center and making his next words come out breathy. "You may frighten the bees." "Bees?" Immediately the girl leapt to her feet and darted a few steps closer to him. Shino observed the fact that she didn't seem particularly scared, mostly just annoyed. "Of course I picked the one spot that is bees." Can this day get any worse?" "Very likely it could," he answered honestly. She spun around with her mouth opening and one finger coming up to jab him in the chest, clearly about to give him a piece of her mind. Then she stopped and froze in place. Her pretty eyes were focused on the sympathies trickling down his cheeks, slowing a bit now but still running steady. With her standing perfectly still in front of him, Shino was able to watch another tear fall from her left eye at the same time he felt one escape from his own, perfectly in sync. "Oh shit. Holy shit. Is that what I think it is?" "No, shut up, I know it's a sympathy." "I'm not stupid." "I did not imply that you might be," he felt compelled to point out. Strangely, she paused as though confused by the notion that he wouldn't think her stupid, one of her hands tugging at her red locks. "Well, whatever. Are those my sympathies?" "That is what we must determine. It would be best to make sure, perhaps by testing it a second time, wouldn't you say?" Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Yeah. I wouldn't want to make that mistake again, I guess." Shino wondered at the story implied by those words but filed it away to ask about later. For now he simply nodded and gestured up at the tree. "Would you like to help me check on the bees?" "Why do you care about some stupid bees?" "Because no one else will." "Oh." The girl blinked at him, her face contorting with several different emotions before settling on a hesitant grin full of mock confidence. "I'm Karen. My name is Shino. I like bees." She laughed a little. "I suppose I could learn to like them too if no one else will." Chapter 130, Hashirama Tobarama, the one where you have their name on your wrist. When the lady Senju gave birth to her second child, she had no name chosen for him, unable to decide between the several family members she wished to honor. It was the happy squealing of her firstborn and a chance look at the elegant script around his tiny wrist which gave her the idea, a snap decision she made with only a tenuous hope forming in her mind. Perhaps it was destiny, she thought, that Hashirama should come to her before she had named his younger brother. "Come here, beloved," she crooned. "I would like you to meet someone special. This is your little brother Tobarama." Toby. Hashirama, as young as he was, had not yet learned to read and therefore did not have any idea of the significance he was about to prove or disprove. The only thoughts in his mind were to joyously greet the new addition to their family. Lady Senju looked on with a curious smile as Hashirama reached into her lap and brushed his fingers against the cheek of the little boy in her arms. "Hello, Toby." When the Lady Senju awoke the next morning to find the faint black smudges on her second-born's wrist solidified into a familiar name, she smiled so widely that she began to laugh, blissful in the knowledge that her children would have such a strong bond to keep them together. Her husband did not share her happiness. At 10 years old, Hashirama was weary of the bindings on his wrists. He was tired of swimming in the ponds or bathing in the springs only to come away with damp wrists which took forever to dry and left wet spots on everything he touched. There was only so old he could grow before the vague excuses his father gave to him about a skin sickness which needed special treatment would be questioned more intently. Tobarama, he knew, was afflicted with the same sickness. Considering the younger boy's inquisitive mind, he would have expected his little brother to ask more questions about this ailment they shared, although it was possible that Tobarama had already asked such questions and received his answers. Their father had been spending more time training Tobirama than himself lately, as the man came to realize that Hashirama's heart was not to be swayed, that he would never be the perfect soldier but Suma thought a Klein head should be. Instead he turned his attentions to shaping his second son, more willing to be molded and more easily shaped into the sharp steel edge of a true shinobi. Not for the first time in his life, Hashirama had decided today to go against his father's wishes. He'd been so young when his wrists had first been covered that he didn't even remember what lay underneath. By now he could recite his father's warnings to never uncover them by heart, but he was tired of it. The medic who treated them always got to see what was underneath when she changed the wrappings, and she had never seemed horrified, so he didn't see what the big deal was. It was time he saw for himself what he was dealing with. 10 years old seemed like a fine rap age to know his own body a little better, and wasn't father always saying that a shinobi should know his own body better than all his tools? That a shinobi's body was his best and ultimate tool. They went hard to unravel, simple linen bandages tied in a knot he had loaned 3 years ago. What they revealed when they fell away, however, changed the way he looked at the world around him. His feet were moving even as the name he saw printed across his flesh was still registering on his young mind, flying across the compound to where he knew another little body would be spending the 1 hour of leisure time he allowed himself every afternoon. Tobirama was knee-deep in a koi pond in the abandoned part of the compound when Hashirama found him. Water sprayed out in every direction, and Tobirama cried out with annoyance, forgetting his top half wet as Hashirama went crashing in to throw his arms around his little brother. "Oh, Toby. My Toby. My soulmate. Get off. What are you going on about?" The younger boy wriggled in his grasp and thumped ineffectually on his arms in a bid for freedom. Hashirama squeezed once more, then let go, lunging for Tobirama's wrists instead. Look. Look. If you take off the wrappings. We are never supposed to take off the wrappings. There's something wonderful underneath. Look. It's my name." Hashirama held the other's wrist aloft triumphantly, displaying the slightly lopsided letters of his own name, and he was smart to see the way Tobirama fell completely silent. But that would mean we are soulmates." "Yeah." The bubbly excitement filling him up fizzled out just a bit when Tobirama looked up at him with those red eyes of his, big and round and shining with some unnamed emotion, so unusual for him. "Why wouldn't anyone tell us? Father must know. The medics must all know. Mother would have known. It must be a secret, but I don't understand why." Oh, Hashirama blinked a few times, his face settling into grim determination. "Then we won't tell anybody that we know. We'll keep it a secret just between us." Tobirama looked down at both of their wrists. "I'm glad you showed me though. Now you'll love me forever, right?" "Hey. I was already gonna love you forever. You're my baby brother." The shy but pleased smile on Tobirama's face was worth any risks he had taken, he decided. Mida could see it from the moment she met them both. It was clear to any observer with half a brain that the Senju brothers shared a bond unlike any other pair of siblings she had ever met. The way they moved around each other, perfectly in sync at all times, communicating with the simplest twitch of a brow or the slightest tilt of a head, spoke of a deep connection she could only wish she had shared with her own sisters. Whether it was a bond forged in battle or simply the luck of having been born into a healthy family she could not say, but there was one thing that Mida could see plainly. She may have been offered as a wife to only one man, but the Senju brothers quite obviously came as a package deal, and theirs was not a bond she should challenge. If she were to have a happy life with Hashirama, she would also need to appease Tobirama and build a good rapport with him as well. Observing the way they stood so close to each other, focused on separate things and yet still so aware of the presence at their side, Mido smiled. If they would each shift a single centimeter closer, they could be holding hands. Finding her place in the Senju main house was going to be an interesting challenge.